It starts in the quiet, not the kind of quiet that feels peaceful, but the kind that creeps in when the world goes still, when you're alone with your thoughts, and they don't quite sound like you. You're lying in bed, your body still, but your mind, not quite. A thought appears, sharp, sudden. Maybe it whispers something about your past, or your worth, or that thing you said 3 years ago that no one else remembers. But your mind keeps repeating like a broken loop. It sounds like truth. It feels like logic, but it leaves a bruise, somewhere soft, just beneath the surface of your skin. These thoughts, they're not just random noise. They're patterns, subtle, predictable, and often wrong. They're called distortions, and they shape how we see ourselves, other people, and the entire world around us. But here's the thing. They don't announce themselves as lies. They show up disguised as facts. They use your voice. They wear your memories like clothing, and they hide inside your most familiar fears. Tonight, we're not here to fight them. We're not even here to fix them. We're just here to see them, to sit quietly beside them, to learn their names, their habits, their rhythm, so you can begin to recognize the shape of your own thinking, not to blame it, not to reject it, but to soften around it, and in doing so, loosen its grip. The darkness is not the enemy here. It's the space where understanding begins. Let's start at the root. It begins not with a lie, but with the way the truth is arranged. It doesn't have to be a lie. It doesn't have to be a threat. All it takes is how the story is told. What are cognitive distortions? Really, you might think you see the world as it is, that what you believe is grounded in facts, and that your reactions make sense because they're based on reality. But the truth is, your mind doesn't show you the world. It shows you a version of it. One that's been filtered, bent, shaped, colored, and carved by every fear, hope, wound, and habit you've ever carried, and most of the time, you don't notice. Cognitive distortions are the invisible hands behind the curtain. They are shortcuts, mental reflexes that try to make sense of the noise. But they often make the world feel sharper, colder, more dangerous than it actually is. They happen so quickly, so automatically, that you don't even realize you're caught in one until your mood sinks or your chest tightens or the night feels heavier than it should. These distortions are not signs of a broken mind. They're signs of a mind trying to survive. Because your brain is built for speed, not accuracy. It wants to keep you safe, not necessarily truthful. So it learns patterns. It scans for danger. And sometimes it creates stories that are louder than reality because those stories have worked before. Maybe you've had a thought like, I always mess things up, or she didn't text me back, so she must be mad at me, or if I'm not perfect, I'm worthless. These aren't just thoughts, they're distortions, and each one fits into a familiar shape, a pattern that psychologists have mapped and named and studied for decades. But when you're the one thinking them, they don't feel like patterns. They feel like truth. And truth, when distorted, hurts in quiet and convincing ways. Let's look deeper. There are dozens of recognized distortions, but most of them stem from a few core habits of thought, like black and white thinking, where everything is either a total success or a complete failure, or catastrophizing, where every small problem spirals into disaster in your mind, or personalization, where you assume everything bad that happens is somehow your fault. These distortions are seductive because they feel like control. If everything is your fault, then at least you understand it. If everything is a disaster, then at least you're prepared for the worst. But in that chase for certainty, you lose something softer: compassion, perspective, reality. And what's worse, Your body responds to distorted thoughts as if they're real. Your heart races, your muscles tense. You lose sleep, not because something happened, but because your mind believed it might. Cognitive distortions don't need facts to feel true. They just need repetition. And the more you repeat them, the more familiar they become. The more familiar they become, the more they feel like your own voice. Eventually, they don't sound like distortions anymore. They sound like you. But they're not. They're habits. They're echoes. They're protective mechanisms from an earlier time, still trying to do their job, even if that job is no longer needed. So what are cognitive distortions really? They are mirrors that bend your reflection. They are echoes of old pain, disguised as logic. They are survival strategies that became beliefs that became self-perception. And once you begin to see them, really see them, you start to loosen the spell. You stop believing every thought just because it showed up. You begin to ask, is this thought helpful? Is it kind? Is it true? Is it mine? And in that quiet space between the thought and your reaction, you start to find something else. Freedom. Not the kind that comes from fixing everything, but the kind that comes from seeing clearly and choosing gently. Not everything your mind tells you is true, but it always thinks it's helping. And sometimes, the first act of healing is simply noticing the voice and whispering back, I see you. Because once you can see it, you begin to ask questions. And one by one, the distortions start to flicker in the dark. But awareness is only the beginning, because these distortions don't live alone. They speak to each other. They feed each other. And some of them have been with you for so long, you've forgotten there was ever another way to think. So next, let's look at the ones that hide in plain sight, the distortions that sound the most reasonable, because they're wrapped in certainty. Let's step softly into the next layer. The most believable lies, all or nothing thinking. It's either perfect or it's worthless. That's how the voice whispers. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't bend. It doesn't allow anything in between. And if you listen closely, you might realize this voice has been with you longer than you thought. It shows up when you try something new. If I can't do it right the first time, I won't do it at all. It speaks when you fail. Either I succeed completely, or I failed entirely. It even appears in love. They either care about me exactly how I need, or they don't care at all. This is all or nothing thinking, and it sounds logical, clean, clear, like you're cutting through the noise and being honest. But really, it's a trick that simplifies the world so much, it turns everything into suffering. Because life, real, messy, human life, doesn't live in extremes, it lives in the middle. And when your mind forgets that, everything becomes unbearable. All or nothing thinking is seductive. It gives the illusion of control. If everything is black or white, then all you need to do is avoid the black. Stay in the white. Be good. Be right. Be perfect. But perfection is exhausting and impossible and lonely, because nothing real can survive inside that frame. No growth, no softness, no forgiveness. When everything is either flawless or broken, there's no space for being human. It's often rooted in fear, fear of failure, fear of rejection, fear of not being enough. And so the mind creates a rule. If I don't win completely, I lose completely. This rule shows up in school, where one bad grade means I'm stupid. It shows up in careers, where one missed deadline means I'm incompetent. It shows up in relationships, where one disagreement means we're not meant to be. The logic feels airtight. But what it really does is trap you inside a cycle of shame and self-blame, where any small mistake becomes evidence of total worthlessness. Even your identity becomes fragile. If you define yourself as strong, then every moment of weakness threatens that identity. If you define yourself as good, then every angry impulse becomes a crisis. If you define yourself as put together, then every crack in the surface feels like exposure, and so you work harder to never slip, to never fall, to never show the gray. But the gray is where your humanity lives. The middle is where your truth breathes. Here's the quiet truth. Most of life is not either or. It's both and. You can be kind and still have sharp edges. You can be flawed and still be worthy. You can fail and still be growing. You can love someone deeply and still disappoint them sometimes. You are not a single snapshot. You are a film, moving, shifting, evolving frame by frame. So what happens when you start to soften all or nothing thinking? You begin to reclaim the middle ground. You begin to notice the shades of effort, the flickers of progress. You begin to speak to yourself differently. Instead of, I ruined everything, you say, I made a mistake, and I can learn from it. Instead of, I'm not good at this, you whisper, I'm still learning. Instead of, I failed, you breathe, I tried. These tiny shifts in language matter because your nervous system listens, and when you offer it gentler framing, it begins to relax. This isn't about lying to yourself. It's about seeing the full picture. It's about understanding that the presence of a flaw doesn't erase the value of the whole. Think of a cloudy sky. You don't say the sky is broken. You say the weather changed. And you know, the sun is still there, even when you can't see it. Your worth is like that, constant, even when covered. All or nothing thinking teaches you to fear every imperfection. But life isn't a test with a single right answer. It's an experience, a process, a series of attempts, sometimes messy, sometimes beautiful, always alive. And the more you can hold both, the success and the failure, the joy and the grief, the light and the shadow, the more human you become. Not broken, not perfect, just real. So tonight, as you rest, if you hear the voice saying you should have done more, that you weren't enough, that it was all or nothing, pause, breathe, and gently say back, I am enough, even in the gray. Because sometimes the truth doesn't shout, it just holds steady, even when your thoughts don't. But there's another trick your mind plays, one that doesn't speak in logic or words or judgments. It speaks in feeling, a tightness in your chest, a sadness you can't explain, a fear that disguises itself as truth just because it feels real. In the next breath, we'll step into the quiet place where emotion becomes evidence and ask, what if your feelings aren't facts, even when they feel like everything? It must be true. When emotion feels like fact, you don't remember when it started, that subtle shift inside where the feeling became the evidence. You weren't told this is the truth, but you felt it, and the feeling was enough. You felt unworthy, so you must have been. You felt abandoned, so you must have been forgettable. You felt anxious, so something terrible must be about to happen. This is how it begins. This is what happens when emotion is mistaken for reality. You didn't choose this. It's not a weakness. It's a survival strategy. Because your nervous system doesn't ask for proof. It asks, am I safe? And sometimes the answer comes not through logic, but through tension in your stomach, the heaviness behind your eyes, the way your shoulders start to rise before you've even had a thought. Your body registers threat before your mind catches up, and before you can ask, is this real? You've already decided it is, because you felt it, and that's all it takes. But feelings lie, not out of malice, but out of memory. They echo what you've learned, what you've been through, what you feared would happen again. And your mind, trying to make sense of the world, takes these feelings and builds beliefs. If I feel rejected, I must be too much. If I feel dread, something bad must be coming. If I feel ashamed, I must have done something wrong. So you carry them, not just as feelings, but as facts. And no one can talk you out of them, because they don't live in your logic. They live in your bones. This is emotional reasoning, where truth is not what is, but what hurts. Where belief is not what's proven, but what's felt. And it's powerful, because no argument can compete with a fear that lives in your body. No evidence can undo what panic has practiced. And even if someone tells you it's not that bad or you're overthinking it, they don't understand. This isn't about thinking. It's about feeling like it's true, and that's what makes it real to you. But here's what no one told you. Just because you feel it doesn't mean it's accurate. It means it's alive. It means it needs tending. It means it's surfacing for a reason. But that reason might be from long ago. You can hold a feeling without building a belief on top of it. You can feel abandoned without being unworthy. You can feel fear without danger being present. You can feel guilt without having done something wrong. The feeling is real, but the story it attaches to might not be. And that difference is what sets you free. Because the goal isn't to stop feeling, it's to learn how to feel without assuming the worst about yourself, to listen without always believing, to sense without surrendering, to hold space for emotion without letting it rewrite your identity. And as you begin to gently pull those two apart, what you feel from what's true, another voice emerges from the shadows. But if something goes wrong, isn't it always my fault? And that quiet weight of self-blame, that's where we go next. It must be me. Personalization and the weight of blame. When something goes wrong, you don't ask what happened. You ask what you did. The silence in their voice, the delay in their reply, the shift in energy, the bad mood that enters the room like smoke. You absorb it all, carry it, own it. It must be me. Because someone has to be responsible, and your nervous system has been trained to assume that someone is always you. This is personalization, a distortion that takes any discomfort, any uncertainty, any shift in someone else's behavior, and filters it through the question, what did I do wrong? Even when you did nothing, even when it's not about you, even when there's no reason to believe you caused it, you still feel responsible. Because feeling responsible feels safer than feeling powerless. And that's the root of it, isn't it? Blame gives you control. If it's your fault, then maybe next time you can prevent it. If it's something you said, then maybe you can fix it. But if it's not you, if people change or drift or hurt you for reasons that have nothing to do with you, then you're not in control. You're just vulnerable. And that's far more terrifying than guilt. So you take it on. You apologize too much. You replay conversations in your head. You assume they're upset with you even when they say they're fine. And when things go wrong, you don't just grieve. You self-blame. You self-analyze. You self-punish. Because that's how your body learned to stay safe in chaos. If you're the cause, you can become the solution. If it's your fault, maybe you can make it stop. But the truth is, you were never meant to hold it all. Not every mood was yours to decode. Not every tension was yours to soothe. Not every shift in someone else was evidence that you were too much or not enough. Sometimes people are distant because they're overwhelmed. Sometimes they're cold because of something you can't see. Sometimes their pain has nothing to do with you at all. But personalization doesn't let you believe that. Because your early life didn't give you the luxury of separation. You learned that other people's storms were warnings, and your best chance of surviving was to change yourself. So how do you stop carrying blame for things that were never yours? You begin with curiosity. Instead of asking, "What did I do wrong?" ask, "What else could this be? Could this be their pain? Could this be something from their day? Could this be my pattern trying to protect me again?" You don't have to dismiss your feelings, but you can start questioning the reflex that says, "It must be me," because it's not always you. And even when it is, you don't have to carry it alone. You are allowed to be imperfect without being punished. You are allowed to make mistakes without becoming the villain. You are allowed to feel guilt without turning it into shame. You are allowed to exist without explanation. But the deeper danger of personalization isn't just blame, it's identity. Because over time, if everything is your fault, you start to believe that you are the flaw. Not just wrong, but fundamentally wrong. And that is the next distortion we begin to face. I should have done more, been more, something more. Never enough. The trap of unrealistic expectations. There's a kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful. It feels unfinished, like you forgot something, like you failed to become someone you were supposed to be. That's the weight of never enough. It doesn't yell. It lingers. It walks just behind you, always slightly out of reach, always whispering. You could have tried harder. You should have known better. You were almost good, but not quite. Unrealistic expectations rarely begin with malice. They begin with love, or fear, or the quiet ache of wanting to be accepted. Maybe someone praised you only when you excelled. Maybe love came with conditions. Maybe failure felt dangerous, or invisible, or both. And somewhere deep inside, you made a silent promise to yourself, "I will never disappoint them again. I will always do better. I will become enough." But enough never had a definition. It only had distance. Unrealistic expectations are shapeshifters. They move the finish line. Every time you reach it, they pull it a little further. You get the job, but now you have to excel. You reach a goal, but now it wasn't impressive enough. You receive praise, but now you have to maintain it forever. There is no rest when your worth is tied to achievement. There is no joy when success is only a brief pause before the next demand. And there is no grace when perfection is the standard. This distortion says, you can't rest yet. You haven't earned it. There's more to fix, more to do, more to prove. And maybe that drive helped you survive. Maybe it kept you focused. Maybe it protected you from shame, from failure, from feelings you didn't know how to hold. But now it's not helping. It's hurting. Because the deeper truth is this: you were never meant to be perfect. You were meant to be whole. Wholeness isn't about doing more. It's about allowing more. More mistakes, more softness, more permission to be human, to fall behind, to not always know what you're doing, to stop chasing an image that was never yours to begin with. So ask yourself gently, what are you trying to become? And who gave you the idea that you had to be that? Where did the rules come from? The standards? The shame? And if you paused, just for a moment, who might you be beneath all the striving? Healing from unrealistic expectations is not laziness. It's liberation. It's remembering that your value isn't conditional, that you don't have to earn your place in the world by being impressive, productive, or extraordinary. It's allowing yourself to be exactly where you are without apology. It's saying, this version of me is still worthy of rest. This version of me is still enough. So tonight, if your mind is listing all the things you didn't do, if it's replaying the missed chances, the imperfect moments, the silent fears that you'll never quite arrive, lay them down. Not because you finished, but because you're allowed to pause. You're allowed to breathe even when the checklist isn't done. You are not a project. You are not a performance. You are a person, a whole, unfinished, beautiful person. But sometimes, even when we stop chasing perfection, even when we let go of the pressure to impress, a quieter distortion remains. A voice that says, they're just being nice. They don't really mean it. You don't deserve this. It's not about doing anymore. It's about believing, and that is where we go next. They said something kind, but they didn't really mean it. I don't deserve this, discounting the positive. You smiled. You said thank you. You nodded politely, but deep down, you didn't believe it. Maybe they said you did a good job. Maybe they told you they appreciated you. Maybe they offered love, or praise, or warmth. And instead of receiving it, your mind whispered, they're just being nice. They're only saying that to make me feel better. They don't really see me. That's what it feels like to discount the positive, to filter out the light and only accept what confirms the darkness. This distortion doesn't look like pain at first. It looks like modesty, humility, realism. But what it hides is a deep belief that the good things don't truly count unless you've earned them completely. And even then, maybe not. It's the habit of deflecting warmth because it feels uncomfortable, or undeserved, or suspicious. And so praise bounces off. Love is questioned. Kindness is explained away. The mind turns gifts into illusions just to protect an identity built on not being enough. Sometimes this habit is learned, when compliments came with conditions, when praise was rare or used to manipulate, when you were taught that celebrating yourself was arrogance, or dangerous, or temporary. So now, when something good happens, you shrink from it. You brush it off. You look for the flaw, because safety to your nervous system means staying suspicious of anything that feels good. But discounting the positive doesn't just affect how you receive others. It warps how you see yourself. You achieve something meaningful, and immediately think, it wasn't that big a deal. You overcome something difficult and say, anyone could have done it. You receive affection and wonder, what do they want from me? Over time, this erodes your ability to internalize progress, growth, connection, or love. You become a master at noticing your failures and blind to your strengths. And the saddest part is, you might not even realize you're doing it, because it feels normal, safe, even logical. But the truth is, every time you discount the positive, you reinforce a deeper belief. I am not worthy of good things. And that belief keeps you locked in a loop where even joy feels suspicious, and healing feels like a lie. But what if you didn't push it away? What if, for just one moment, you paused and let it in? What if you simply said, maybe they meant it? Maybe I do deserve a little light, even if you don't fully believe it yet, because belief comes slowly, but openness begins with a breath. Try this. When someone offers something kind, pause. Notice the part of you that wants to deflect. Smile at it. Thank it for trying to protect you, and then gently ask, what would it feel like to let this moment be real? Not perfect, not forever, just real. Because you don't have to earn kindness. You don't have to be flawless to be loved. You don't have to be extraordinary to be worthy of simple, good things. So tonight, if your mind tries to replay the criticism, the doubt, the reasons why you're not enough, remind yourself, you've survived things that no one sees. You've kept going when it would have been easier to give up. You've shown up again and again, even with an aching heart. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. Let the good things count. Let the soft moments land. Let the small victories matter, because they do. So tonight, if someone says something kind, and your first instinct is to doubt it, dismiss it, or hand it back. Don't rush to believe it. Just pause. Let the moment linger, not because you're sure, but because you're allowed. And in that quiet allowing, you may notice something else. A flicker of discomfort, a tension in your chest, an unease that asks, what if it doesn't last? What if something goes wrong? What if I let this in and then I lose it? Because for some of us, receiving good things isn't the hardest part. Keeping them is. And that's where the mind steps in with its oldest trick, preparing for disaster before anything ever breaks. What if it all falls apart? What if I lose everything? What if this feeling is the beginning of the end? What if something goes wrong? Catastrophizing. It starts with a flicker, a moment, a thought, a strange silence in someone's voice, an unanswered message, a small, unexpected ache in your body, and then the spiral begins. Your mind doesn't stop at the moment. It builds a future, a terrifying, vivid, unstoppable future where everything that can go wrong does. That's catastrophizing, a distortion that turns possibility into probability, worry into certainty, and life into a waiting room for disaster. This isn't about being dramatic. It's about protection. Because somewhere deep in your wiring, the brain learned that if it could imagine the worst, it might be able to avoid it. So it plays the tape forward, over and over. Not to scare you, but to save you. But in the process, it costs you the present. Catastrophizing turns small discomforts into signs of collapse. A simple mistake becomes the end of your career. A friend's bad mood becomes the end of the relationship. A missed call becomes a crisis. A headache becomes a diagnosis. The mind becomes a searchlight, sweeping for danger, finding shadows, and calling them truth. It doesn't matter that the danger hasn't happened. It feels like it already has. And your body believes it. Your heart races. Your muscles tighten. Your breath shortens. You're living in a world that hasn't occurred, fighting fires that don't exist, feeling the pain of losses that haven't happened. And still, you can't stop. Because the mind says, if I let my guard down, I won't be ready. If I prepare for the worst, I won't be caught off guard. If I don't imagine it, it'll hurt more when it comes. But pain imagined 1,000 times doesn't hurt less. It only wears you down before anything has even gone wrong. Catastrophizing doesn't just drain your energy. It breaks your trust. In the world, in others, in yourself. You stop believing things will work out. You stop believing you can handle it. You stop believing in rest. Because how can you rest when something terrible might be waiting just around the corner? But here's what catastrophizing doesn't tell you. You've already survived so much. Things have gone wrong before, and you're still here. You didn't break. You bent. You adapted. You found your way through. Your fear doesn't need to predict the future in order to keep you safe. Sometimes you can be safe and not know what happens next. So how do you break the spiral? You come back to now. You place a hand on your chest. You feel the ground beneath your feet. You ask, what is happening right now? Not what might happen, not what could happen, but what is. You remind your body, this moment is not a crisis. This breath is not an emergency. This silence is not a threat. And even if something does go wrong, you don't have to suffer it 1,000 times in advance. So tonight, if your mind begins to spiral, building futures you didn't ask for, constructing nightmares in vivid detail, you don't have to fight it. You just have to anchor yourself. Here, now this pillow, this breath, this moment, because the future hasn't arrived yet. And this is still soft. This is still yours. This is still safe. But sometimes it's not the disaster we fear. It's the fact that we'll have to face it alone. Because even in a crowded room, there's a distortion that whispers, you don't really belong. You're not truly connected. You're always on the outside. And that is where we go next. You can be surrounded by people and still feel completely alone. No one really gets me, the illusion of disconnection. It doesn't always hurt like a wound. Sometimes it just feels distant, like you're behind glass, like you're nodding, smiling, answering, but not really in the room. You hear your own voice. You see yourself playing the part. But inside, there's a quiet ache. I don't belong here. They don't really know me. If I disappeared, would it matter? This is the illusion of disconnection, a distortion that doesn't isolate you physically. It isolates you emotionally, from love, from meaning, from the feeling of being seen. It doesn't begin in adulthood. It begins when you're young and realize something subtle, but earth-shaking, that being yourself doesn't always make people stay. So you start to edit, to shrink, to shift, to play it safe, to become who they need so you don't end up alone, and you survive. But you also lose something, your voice, your weirdness, your edges, your need to be understood. And now, even when people care, something inside whispers, they wouldn't if they really knew me. This is what disconnection does. It replaces presence with performance. It replaces closeness with comparison. It replaces intimacy with invisibility. You can laugh. You can touch. You can be fine. But inside, there's a story looping. No one gets me. No one sees me. I'm alone here and always will be. And the tragedy is, you don't question it, because the pain is so familiar, it feels like truth. But what if it's not true? What if the distance you feel isn't a reflection of your worth, but a result of old protection? Because once, being vulnerable didn't go well, and now your mind would rather feel lonely than feel exposed. So you stay safe, you stay hidden, you stay performing. And the connection you crave remains out of reach, not because it doesn't exist, but because it can't find you behind the mask. This distortion is cruel because it's self-reinforcing. The more disconnected you feel, the more you pull away. The more you pull away, the harder it becomes to be seen, and the harder it is to be seen, the more alone you feel. It's not your fault. It's the mind trying to protect you from a pain you've already felt once and promised never to feel again. But survival strategies can outlive their usefulness, and what once kept you safe can now keep you stuck. So what's the way out? It's not grand confessions. It's not perfect friendships. It's not finding someone who reads your mind. It's this: tiny moments of truth, the courage to be honest in small ways. I'm actually struggling today. I don't really feel like I fit in here. I wish I felt closer. And when someone meets you in that space, even for a moment, the illusion flickers. Because connection doesn't require being fully understood. It only requires being real for just long enough to let someone in. If the ache is still there, that sense that something's missing even when everything seems fine, don't turn away from it. Trace it inward, to the part of you that stopped reaching out because reaching out once ended in silence. To the part of you that learned to stay small, just to stay included, and when the ache whispers, they don't really get me, listen closely. Because sometimes it's not about whether others understand you. It's about whether you've given yourself permission to be seen. But when the ache lingers too long, when even vulnerability doesn't bring relief, when connection begins to feel like a performance, the mind draws a sharper conclusion, colder, quieter, more final. It stops wondering and starts believing. I must be broken. And that's where the next shadow begins. I must be broken. The shame of internal defectiveness. There's a moment, quiet, small, almost invisible, when you stop asking, why do I feel this way? And start believing, it must be because of who I am. Not because something happened, not because of what someone did, but because something inside you is wrong, rotten, not enough, too much. That's the distortion of internal defectiveness. A belief not that you made a mistake, but that you are one. This is not loud shame. It doesn't scream through guilt. It whispers in resignation, a tired acceptance, a heaviness that says, this is just who I am. This is why things never work out. This is why I ruin everything I touch. It doesn't need to explain itself. It just sits in the room, like smoke, like dust, like something you forgot how to live without. Sometimes this shame has no clear beginning, just a slow accumulation of moments where your needs weren't met, your emotions weren't welcomed, your uniqueness wasn't held with care. So you did what children do. You turned inward. You made it about you. If they can't love me, I must not be lovable. If they don't stay, I must be the reason. If they hurt me, maybe I deserved it. And the mind believed it. Not because it was true, but because it was safer than believing no one would ever come back. Shame is not a feeling. It's a frame, a lens that distorts how you see everything. You can't accept compliments because they don't fit the picture. You can't receive love because it doesn't align with the story. You can't even imagine being truly at peace because peace belongs to people who are whole. And somewhere along the line, you decided you never were. So what does this shame do? It makes you sabotage good things before they leave you. It makes you settle for pain because it feels familiar. It makes you hide your needs because you assume they're too much. It makes you shrink so no one sees how broken you are. And when people get close, you pull away, not because you don't want love, but because you can't believe they'd want you if they really knew. This is the trap of defectiveness. It tells you, if you're always the problem, you'll never be caught off guard. You'll never be betrayed. You'll never have to hope for too much. But what it doesn't tell you is that shame doesn't protect. It imprisons. It doesn't make you safer. It makes you smaller. It keeps you walking in circles, searching for evidence that you can't be accepted while quietly longing for someone who proves you wrong. If the voice still lingers, not screaming, not warning, just stating as if it's always been true, I must be broken. Pause, not to argue, not to correct, but to listen. Because the voice that says you are defective was often born in the absence of anyone else who could say otherwise. It is not you. It is what you became in a world that didn't know how to hold you. And maybe you don't need to be perfect to be healed. Maybe you don't need to be flawless to be worthy. Maybe you don't need to be anyone else to be enough. Just you, as you are, even now, especially now. But when the belief runs deep, the body joins in. And even as you begin to release the shame, you start preparing for the next collapse. Not because it's coming, but because your nervous system never learned how to stop bracing. Eyes open, heart alert, mind scanning, even in peace, you prepare for pain. Preparing for the worst, hypervigilance and the anxiety of control. You don't remember choosing it, but somewhere along the way, your body made a vow. I'll stay alert, just in case. It wasn't about paranoia. It was about survival. Because when danger doesn't come with warning signs, you start creating your own. That's hypervigilance, a state of constant scanning, a nervous system that doesn't believe in rest. Not because there's always danger, but because there was. And now peace feels suspicious. It shows up quietly. You overanalyze every tone. You reread every message. You replay conversations, wondering what you missed. You plan for contingencies that will never happen. You anticipate disasters that don't arrive. You imagine betrayal before love even settles. Because if you expect it, you won't be shocked. If you prepare for it, you won't be destroyed. That's what the mind believes. That's how it protects you. But it doesn't protect you. It steals from you, bit by bit, moment by moment. You see, hypervigilance is exhausting, not just mentally, but cellularly. It's the tightness in your jaw, the tension in your gut, the inability to fully let go, even when everything around you is safe. You're never quite here, because some part of you is always leaning forward into the next imagined crisis. And in doing so, you never get to feel the now. It's not your fault. For many, hypervigilance began not with trauma, but with unpredictability, a home that changed moods without reason, a caregiver whose love had conditions, a world that punished softness or mocked stillness. You learn to stay ready, to anticipate, to manage everything before it began, because if you could just control enough, you wouldn't have to feel helpless again. Control became your safety, your armor, your religion. But over time, control becomes a prison, because no matter how tightly you grip, life still surprises you. People still leave, feelings still rise, the body still breaks, and uncertainty still finds a way in. So what now? Do you just stop bracing, let go and fall? You begin gently. You practice letting go in small, safe spaces, a breath you don't rush, a plan you don't double-check, a moment of silence you don't fill with thought, not because danger is gone, but because you're not in it anymore. Your body just hasn't been told yet. Let it learn, slowly, lovingly. That peace is not a trap. That stillness is not neglect. That calm is not something to fear. It's something you've earned, even if it still feels unfamiliar. If you're still scanning the world, looking for signs of what might go wrong, trying to stay one step ahead of pain, know this: you don't have to catch everything to be okay. You don't have to predict the future to survive it. And you don't have to hold it all together to be safe. Sometimes, letting go is the safest thing. But when you finally exhale, when the silence returns, when the alarms go quiet, another fear can begin to rise. Not the fear of danger, but the fear that no matter where you are or what you do, you will always feel apart. Not like everyone else. Not whole. Not right. Not broken because of what you've been through, but because of what you are. And that is where we drift next. Too different to belong. Feeling fundamentally other. There's a kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone. It comes from being apart, from feeling like you're on the outside of something you don't know how to enter. You walk through life smiling when they smile, laughing at the right moments, playing your part. But somewhere inside, you still feel like a stranger in a world that doesn't quite speak your language. You're not disconnected. You're different. And not in a way that feels special, in a way that feels unreachable. This is the distortion of feeling fundamentally other, the quiet belief that no matter how hard you try, you'll never quite fit. Not because you're broken, but because you're made from something that no one else seems to recognize. It's not always pain. Sometimes it's just distance, a half step behind, a half tone off, a sense that everyone else got the script, and you're still improvising every line. You notice what they don't say. You feel what they dismiss. You carry the weight of what others call too much, because you've never known how to feel any less. And the more you notice your own depth, the more alone you feel within it. Maybe it started in childhood, when your thoughts were too deep, your feelings too much, your wonder too strange. Maybe you were told to tone it down, to be more like them, to color inside the lines that were never made for you. Or maybe you weren't told anything at all, just left to translate yourself in a world that didn't ask and didn't notice you were trying. So you built your own language. You learned to carry secrets in silence, to smile through confusion, to mirror what others expected, hoping one day it might become real. But it never quite did. And so you adapted. You learned how to mimic closeness, how to blend, how to be agreeable enough to avoid rejection, and invisible enough to avoid attention. You walked the in-between, not invisible, but not embraced, not rejected, but never fully invited in. And now, even when people like you, even when they reach out, you wait. For the moment they'll realize you don't really fit here, that maybe they were wrong about you, that maybe you were right all along, that you're too strange, too intense, too thoughtful, too intuitive, too something that they won't be able to name, only feel. And when they do, you fear they'll leave. Or worse, stay, but never really see you. Because what you long for is not attention, it's recognition. That slow, quiet miracle of someone getting it, without needing you to explain. But the world doesn't always offer that. Not at first. It teaches you to perform, to adjust, to survive by being palatable. And so, your uniqueness becomes your silence. Your depth becomes your loneliness. Your inner world becomes a locked room that no one has the key to. Not because they don't want to enter, but because you stopped inviting them in. Because it hurt too much to open the door and still feel unseen. This kind of loneliness doesn't fade with company. It doesn't shrink with praise. It doesn't vanish with belonging that is conditional. Because it's not about who you're with. It's about whether who you are is allowed to exist without being corrected. So what now? Do you keep hiding? Keep molding? Keep becoming what feels safe to others but foreign to yourself? Or do you begin the slow work of returning to the parts you buried to belong? The messy ones, the unexplainable ones, the tender, electric, beautifully odd ones that make you who you are. Because the people you truly belong with won't need you to translate. They'll already speak the language you thought was made up. They'll recognize your rhythm, your quiet, your chaos. They won't flinch at your shadow or worship your light. They'll sit in the middle and stay. Not because you've convinced them, but because they've been looking for you too. But first, you have to stop apologizing for the shape of your soul. You have to stop diluting your softness to fit the sharpness around you. You have to let yourself take up space, as you are, without shrinking, without rehearsing, without trying to make it easier for them to stay. Because your belonging will never come from what you manage to suppress. It will only come when you dare to reveal what's always been there. If tonight you still feel like you don't quite fit anywhere, don't turn that into shame. Let it be signal. Let it be evidence that you are not lost. You are simply rare. And rare things take longer to find each other. But sometimes, even when the right person comes along, even when you are seen, a different kind of fear arises. Not fear of being hurt, but fear of hoping. Because if you open your heart again, and it breaks, you don't know if you'll survive it this time. And that is the next place we drift into. Hope hurts. 2. Fear of vulnerable connection. It's not the pain that scares you. You've survived that. Over and over. You know how to carry it, how to fold it into silence, how to keep going, even when something inside you has stopped. It's not the hurt you're afraid of. It's the hope. Because to hope means to want, to reach, to open, to imagine something better. And that is dangerous. Because what if you reach and nothing meets you? This is the distortion that hides behind the walls you've built. The belief that opening your heart will only invite collapse. So you keep your distance. You smile through the longing. You laugh in the right places. You play safe. You might even love, but never fully. You give enough to keep people close, but never enough to let them in. Because somewhere along the way, you learned that vulnerability doesn't lead to closeness. It leads to loss. Maybe it was subtle. A parent who praised you only when you performed. A friend who vanished when you spoke your truth. A lover who said they wanted all of you, then disappeared when you showed your shadow. Maybe it wasn't one moment. Maybe it was a slow drip. 1,000 little times when being open led to being left. So your nervous system made a rule. Don't hope too much. Don't love too fully. Don't trust what feels good. Because if you never expect anything, you can't be disappointed. But that rule has a cost. Because while it protects you from devastation, it also keeps you from joy, from connection, from the softness you long for but don't know how to allow. And so you live in between, half safe, half starving, craving closeness, but flinching when it gets too near. It's not that you don't want to love. It's that you don't want to lose yourself in the wreckage if it all falls apart again. And no one taught you how to let someone in without giving everything away. So you ghost yourself. You disappear before they can. You withhold the parts of you that long to be held. You sabotage the tenderness. You pull back when it gets too warm. You silence your needs because asking feels like exposure. You pretend you're fine because fine doesn't get abandoned. But the truth? Fine is lonely. Fine is empty. Fine is where hope goes to die quietly. The fear of vulnerable connection is not weakness. It's memory. Your body remembering what your mind tries to forget. That the last time you opened, someone didn't stay, or worse. They stayed just long enough to make you believe it was finally safe. And that's what made the fall so cruel. So what do you do with this fear? You don't override it. You don't fix it. You don't force yourself to trust when your cells are still bracing for loss. You meet it, gently, like you would a frightened child. You say, I know you're scared. I know it's not easy to open. I know it's safer to hold it all inside. And then, you let yourself open just a little, just enough to feel the risk and survive it. Because healing isn't about never being afraid. It's about staying open, even with the fear. It's about letting someone see you cry and not apologizing for it. It's about saying, I missed you, even if they might not say it back. It's about loving with both feet on the ground, not because you're sure they'll stay, but because you are choosing to. That's vulnerability, not weakness, not recklessness, but the quiet strength to say, I'm here, I'm willing, I'm real. If your heart still pulls back every time someone gets too close, don't shame it. That part of you is not broken. It's just careful. Let it be slow. Let it be soft. Let it relearn, moment by moment, that not every door leads to disaster. That sometimes a knock on your heart is not the beginning of an ending, but the beginning of something you never thought you'd be allowed to feel again. But even when you begin to let love in, even when someone stays, the mind may still return to its oldest pattern, finding what's wrong. Because sometimes the closer we get to peace, the more we fear we don't deserve it. And that is the distortion waiting just beneath the surface. Finding the flaw, the compulsion to ruin what feels good. It's quiet at first, almost gentle. Things are going well. They smile at you. You feel safe. You feel wanted. You feel something good blooming. And then, a flicker, a shift, a tightening in your chest. A voice you didn't invite whispers, "This won't last. There's something wrong. Look closer." So you do, and you find it. A flaw, a crack, a reason. Any reason to doubt what's good. This is the compulsion to ruin what feels good, to dismantle joy before it gets a chance to disappear on its own. It doesn't come from bitterness. It comes from fear, because the better something feels, the more dangerous it becomes. If you fall in love, you could lose them. If you feel proud, you might fail tomorrow. If you relax, you won't see the disaster coming. So the mind does something cruel, but clever. It finds the flaw, and fixates, and pokes, and pushes, until the good thing no longer feels good. And now, you don't have to fear losing it, because you already broke it yourself. This self-sabotage doesn't always look like destruction. Sometimes it looks like perfectionism, overthinking, testing people to see if they'll stay, picking fights you don't understand, pushing away compliments, discounting love, undermining success. It's not about ruining everything. It's about protecting yourself from being devastated when the goodness inevitably leaves. Because at some point, you stopped trusting joy. You started treating it like a trick, a setup, a trap. Maybe you were hurt right when you let your guard down. Maybe happiness was always brief, followed by chaos. Maybe love came with conditions that turned warmth into pressure. Maybe every time you finally felt safe, something crumbled. And so your nervous system learned goodness isn't a gift, it's bait. The mind adapts, and your new strategy becomes find what's wrong before it can hurt you. It feels smart, it feels necessary, but over time, it erodes your ability to feel peace. Because even when life is kind, even when people do stay, even when you're finally okay, you can't let yourself enjoy it. You're too busy watching it fall apart in your head. So how do you stop? Not by convincing yourself everything is fine, not by pretending you're not scared, not by silencing the voice that searches for flaws. You stop by noticing what that voice is trying to do, protect you, warn you, keep you from fully relaxing into something you don't yet believe you deserve. And instead of arguing with it, you sit beside it. You say, I see you. I know what you're trying to do. But this moment is still allowed to feel good, even if it doesn't last. Even if I'm scared. Even if it's not perfect. Because joy doesn't require certainty. Peace doesn't mean nothing ever goes wrong. Love doesn't have to be flawless to be real. And when you stop trying to control the outcome, you make space to actually live inside the experience, the sweetness, the stillness, the soft miracle of something going right and not needing to ruin it first. If you feel the urge to sabotage, to poke holes in good things, to chase doubts just to feel safe, pause, not to force gratitude, not to ignore the fear, but to gently name what's happening. This is fear, dressing up as logic. This is old pain, pretending to protect me. This is a scar, not a sign. And let yourself stay, even for one more breath, even for one more beat of something that feels almost okay, because staying is how trust begins again. But sometimes you don't sabotage just because you fear loss. You sabotage because a deeper voice says, you don't deserve this. And that leads us into one of the oldest distortions of all. Not meant for me. The belief that good things aren't yours. Some people hope. Some people expect. Some people believe the best is yet to come. And then there are those who don't. Not because they're cynical. Not because they've given up. but because something inside them was shaped around the belief that good things happen, but not to them. They cheer for others. They celebrate their wins quietly. They smile when friends fall in love. They say, "I'm so happy for you." And they mean it. They do. But somewhere underneath the warmth is an ache, a whisper that says, "That kind of life isn't meant for me." This is one of the oldest distortions, not dramatic, not loud. Just a quiet, permanent background belief that goodness is something to witness, not receive. It doesn't always start with trauma. Sometimes it starts with patterns. A home where joy was rare. A childhood where needs were a burden. Where every time something felt safe, it was taken away too soon. So the mind learned not to reach for more, not to dream too high, not to risk believing that maybe, just maybe, things could turn out okay. When this belief sets in, it shows up everywhere. You get close to love, but pull away. You receive praise, and immediately minimize it. You touch success, but look for the ways it's unstable. Because on some deep level, your nervous system is wired to assume that goodness can't stay because it was never really yours to begin with. You're just borrowing it, and eventually, someone will come collect. So you build your life not around desire, but around expectation. Not around joy, but around endurance. You learn to hold back your excitement because excitement feels like a setup. You learn to be grateful for crumbs because asking for more feels like asking to be punished. And even when life softens, even when someone loves you without condition, you feel out of place in the sweetness, like a guest at a table you were never truly invited to. But what if it's not true? What if the problem was never that good things aren't yours, but that you never had someone who made you feel safe to receive them? What if your ability to hope was not broken, just untaught? And what if your life doesn't have to be earned through suffering to be deserved? This belief doesn't just block joy. It reshapes identity. You stop seeing yourself as someone good things happen to, and instead, you become the background character in your own story. You don't imagine possibility. You imagine surviving. You don't wonder what could light you up. You wonder what won't hurt too much to lose. But this isn't who you are. It's who you became to protect yourself from being disappointed one more time. You don't need to force positivity. You don't need to fake worthiness. But you do need to question the rules you inherited. Who taught you that comfort wasn't for you? Who made you feel like joy was a luxury you couldn't afford? Who told you, in words or silence, that your role was to hold pain, not pleasure? And why are you still obeying rules that were made by people who didn't know how to love you? If you've spent most of your life watching joy from behind glass, if you've learned to be happy for others but numb to your own hope, if you brace yourself whenever something good begins to bloom, please hear this. You didn't miss your chance. You didn't break something sacred. You didn't get skipped when the world handed out magic. You were just taught to keep your hands in your lap while everyone else reached for the stars. And now, you can learn something new. Start small. Let yourself want things even if you're afraid. Let yourself imagine being loved without waiting for the goodbye. Let yourself feel pride without looking over your shoulder. Let yourself taste joy without rehearsing the fall. You don't have to convince yourself you're ready. You just have to let the possibility exist, that this might be real, that this might be yours, that you don't need to perform or earn or prove, only receive. But even when you begin to receive, even when you begin to believe that something good might be for you, the old fear returns in a new disguise, a single question that shakes it all. What if I lose it? And sometimes, the fear of losing what you love becomes louder than the joy of having it, and that is what we begin to face next. When good things feel unsafe, anticipatory grief, and preemptive loss. Sometimes what scares you isn't the pain, it's the softness. Because when something finally feels safe, the mind starts bracing, not because danger is here, but because the good thing is, and good things don't stay. So you don't relax, you don't bask in it, you don't melt into the warmth. You start preparing for the phone call, the shift, the silence, the betrayal, the distance, the goodbye you're already practicing in your head. This is anticipatory grief, the heartbreak that comes before the loss, a kind of mourning that begins while the moment is still alive. You laugh, but halfway through, a thought pierces the joy. What if this is the last time you fall in love? But you scan their face for signs of disinterest before they've even finished holding your hand. You succeed, but instead of pride, you feel dread, because now you have something to lose, and that feels more dangerous than never having it at all. This is preemptive loss, a mind that tries to beat heartbreak to the punch, to grieve early so the fall won't hurt as much later, but it doesn't work. You still feel the loss. You just feel it twice. Once in your imagination, and once again when life happens in whatever way it does. Why does the good feel unsafe? Because good requires surrender, presence, softness, a letting go of control. And if you've lived a life where things were taken just when you started to trust them, your body will associate goodness with danger. You'll feel more in control when things are hard, because that's predictable. You know how to suffer. You know how to survive. But you don't yet know how to stay inside something tender without scanning for the exit. So you hold joy at a distance. You protect yourself with detachment. You tell yourself, this probably won't last. I shouldn't get too comfortable. I'll just enjoy it while it's here. But what you call realistic is sometimes just rehearsed grief. It doesn't make the pain smaller. It just makes your joy haunted. And that's the true cost of anticipatory grief. You don't actually avoid loss. You just sacrifice presence. The thing you were afraid to lose was never fully yours because you were never fully in it. Your body was bracing. Your mind was spinning. Your heart was somewhere else in a future where it's all gone. And so you miss the very thing you were trying to protect. So how do you stay? How do you stay when it feels dangerous to feel good? You start by noticing when you're leaving the moment, when the joy starts to scare you, when the fear begins to write the ending before the story has even begun. You pause, you breathe, you whisper, I don't need to mourn this before it's gone. I'm allowed to have this while it's here. Even if it ends later, I don't have to end it now. That's the shift. You're not pretending it will last forever. You're just refusing to abandon it before life decides anything for you. You're not denying impermanence. You're choosing presence. You're saying, this moment deserves me in it, not just watching it from the doorway. And maybe, for the first time, you don't rehearse the goodbye. You live the hello, fully, softly, even with the fear. But for some, that's still too much, because joy itself feels jinxed. Happiness feels like tempting fate. And somewhere deep inside, a belief rises up. Don't get too happy. And that is where we go next. Don't get too happy, the superstition of emotional safety. There are things we believe without ever saying them aloud. Things we never write down, never confess, never even question. But they guide our lives, like a rule that was whispered once, by fear, by pain, by memory, and never forgotten. Don't get too happy. because something bad always follows, because joy makes you vulnerable, because if you get too high, the fall will crush you. This is the superstition of emotional safety, a silent contract with life that says, if I keep my joy small, maybe nothing will come to take it from me. It's not logic, it's not math, it's a ritual. The ritual of staying quiet when you want to celebrate, of brushing off compliments, of acting like it's not a big deal, even when your heart is glowing, because to feel it fully would be to risk losing it fully. Where does this come from? Sometimes from childhood, a home where good news was met with silence, where happiness was always interrupted, where laughter quickly turned to shouting. You learned that joy wasn't safe, that happiness made you a target. Or worse, that happiness always meant something bad was coming, so you made yourself smaller, quieter. You learned to dim your joy before life could blow it out. Other times it starts with loss, a love that felt too good, a moment that felt too whole, and then gone. So your body learned a new law. If I feel this again, I won't survive it. And that belief became a boundary around every good thing, a line you never let yourself cross, because on the other side is too much light, and too much light feels like a warning. So you smile, but never too wide. You succeed, but never stop looking over your shoulder. You love, but only with one foot in the door, and people may never notice. They'll call you humble, grateful, grounded, but deep down, you know what it really is. Fear. Fear of the wrath that comes for those who dare to feel good too deeply. This isn't just a belief, it's a superstition. And like all superstitions, it lives in the body, not the mind. So even if you know better, even if you tell yourself it's okay to feel joy, your chest tightens anyway. Your gut pulls back. Your smile fades just before the moment could become real. Because some part of you still believes that joy has a price, and you're not sure you can pay it again. So what do we do with this superstition? We don't crush it. We don't shame it. We don't force ourselves to just be happy. We get curious. Where did I learn this? Who taught me that happiness invites punishment, that joy is risky, that pleasure means vulnerability? And what does it cost me to believe that? How many moments have I stepped out of, not because they were unsafe, but because they were too good? How many times have I left joy early just to say, see, I knew it wouldn't last? Because that's what this belief really protects, the illusion of control. If I ruin it first, it won't hurt as much. If I downplay it, I won't have to grieve it. If I expect the worst, I won't be blindsided. But that's not protection. That's pre-loss. That's emotional exile. That's a life of walking out on yourself before life ever gets the chance to. So tonight, if something good is blooming and you feel yourself shrinking away from it, don't run. Stay, even if it's unfamiliar, even if your heart races, even if your body whispers, this is too much. It's not too much. It's just unfamiliar. And unfamiliar isn't the same as unsafe. You can let joy live. You don't have to punish it first. But when you begin to allow it, when joy becomes real, when goodness feels possible, a new thought arises. What if I enjoy this? And they take it from me anyway. And that thought is not just fear. It's grief. The grief of never having felt safe in the first place. And that is where we continue. Love is conditional. When safety depends on performance, it starts quietly. You notice that when you're helpful, you're safe. When you smile, they stay. When you succeed, they're proud. But when you cry, when you say no, when you disappoint, the air changes. The warmth fades. The room feels colder. So you begin to adapt. You show the parts they like. You hide the ones they don't. You become easy to love by becoming easy to manage. This is conditional love. Not because people said it directly, but because your nervous system learned that connection depends on compliance. And over time, this doesn't just change how you behave. It changes how you see yourself. You don't feel lovable. You feel useful. You don't feel safe in love. You feel employed by it. Like every relationship is a job you can be fired from if you stop performing. So you keep working. You keep showing up. You keep doing whatever it takes to avoid the silence. But here's what makes this distortion so powerful. It feels like you. You think you're just a people pleaser. You think you just like being helpful. You say, I don't want to be a burden. But deep down, it's not preference. It's protection. Because if love was inconsistent, if approval was earned, if safety came only when you behaved a certain way, then your body learned the only way to survive was to become whatever they needed. And you did. But the cost is high, because now, even when someone loves you, you don't trust it. You keep waiting for the shift, the sigh, the disappointment, the withdrawal. You believe their warmth depends on your performance. So you overthink every word. You apologize too much. You read between every line. You try to be good, but you don't feel good. You feel tired, like you're holding up a version of yourself you're afraid to put down. Conditional love doesn't just teach you how to act. It teaches you how to disappear, how to slowly erase your needs, your anger, your sadness, your weirdness, until only the acceptable version of you remains. And even then, you wonder if it's enough. So you try harder, be nicer, achieve more, stay smaller, say less, not because you want to, but because you're terrified of what might happen if you stop. So what does healing look like? It's not about becoming bolder. It's not about being loud or reckless. It's about slowly realizing that love doesn't have to be earned. It's about finding spaces where you can show up messy and they don't flinch, where you can be quiet and they don't disappear, where you don't have to bring value, you just bring you, and that's enough. But here's the hardest part. Even when someone does love you fully, your body still waits for the price, because love, for so long, was a transaction. And when it isn't, your nervous system doesn't know what to do. It says, this can't be real. This will change. This isn't safe. And in those moments, you might pull away, sabotage, or retreat into silence. Not because you don't care, but because you don't know how to stay without performing. So, be gentle with yourself. This fear is not proof that you're broken. It's proof that you learned to survive in a world that asked you to shapeshift for love. And now, you're learning something radical. That love is not a reward. It's not a wage. It's not something you perform for. It's something you receive, even when you're tired, even when you disappoint, even when you're not trying. If someone is offering you love without asking for a version of you in return, and it scares you, don't run. Let yourself stay. Let your body tremble and still remain. Because this is not danger. This is unfamiliar safety. And unfamiliar safety can feel like fear at first. But when love no longer requires performance, another question begins to rise. Then who am I without it? And that is the next layer we begin to explore. The collapse of identity. When survival becomes who you are sometimes, the mask grows so close to your skin you forget it's a mask. You forget that it had a beginning, that it came from somewhere, that it was built, piece by piece, to protect you. And one day, you stop remembering the version of yourself that existed before the armor. This is what happens when survival becomes identity. It starts innocently. You adapt. You read the room. You become who they need. You say what won't upset them. You achieve what makes them proud, not to deceive, but to stay safe. And it works, so you keep doing it, again and again and again, until one day you wake up and don't know who you are outside the performance. You become the strong one, the quiet one, the achiever, the peacemaker, the overthinker, the one who never complains, the one who's always fine, and you wear it so well that even you start to believe it. But late at night, when no one's watching, you feel it, a hollowness, a mismatch, a whisper that says, "This isn't me." But you don't know who me is anymore, because that version, the original version, was never allowed to stay. Maybe you learned this early, that certain parts of you weren't welcome. Your anger, your joy, your questions, your softness, your boundaries. So you buried them, not because you wanted to, but because you had to. You had to become someone who could survive the rooms you were put in, the roles you were handed, the silence you were told to carry. And you did it so well that the world forgot to ask how much it cost you. But even now, in this moment, you might still feel afraid to let go of the mask. Because if I'm not the achiever, who will approve of me? If I'm not the caretaker, will anyone stay? If I stop pretending, will I be abandoned? This is the collapse, not a destruction, but a slow undoing, a falling away of everything you thought you had to be. And it's terrifying, because survival gave you identity, but it never gave you self. So who are you when you're not performing? Who are you when you don't owe anyone an explanation? Who are you when you're no longer responsible for everyone else's emotions? Maybe you don't know yet. Maybe that answer hasn't formed. Maybe all you know is that you're tired of holding up the version everyone else accepted. And that's enough. Because collapse isn't the end of you. It's the beginning. The beginning of grief. The grief for all the years you spent being someone else. The grief for the you who wasn't allowed to be chosen. The grief for the instincts you ignored. The no's you swallowed. The dreams you postponed so you could be useful, so you could belong. And this grief is necessary, because only when you mourn who you had to become can you start remembering who you truly are, not the version you crafted, not the one who never caused problems, not the one who never needed help, but the one you buried beneath it all, still breathing, still there, waiting for you to come back. But even in this collapse, there's a voice that rises, a voice that says, you still have to keep it together. You still have to hold the role. If you fall apart, everything will fall apart with you. And that voice is what we begin to meet next. Shame scripts, the narratives that keep you small. There's a voice inside that doesn't yell. It doesn't even sound angry. It just narrates softly, consistently, like a background hum you stop noticing. And what it says is simple. You're too much. You're not enough. You don't belong. It's always your fault. And you believe it. Because you've heard it for so long, it doesn't feel like a voice anymore. It feels like truth. This is shame, but not the loud kind, not the kind that shows up in public collapse. This is private shame, subtle shame, internalized shame, the kind that writes a script and hands it to you before you even know how to speak, the kind that tells you how you're allowed to exist, quietly, carefully, without need, without disruption. And the script is specific. It's different for everyone, but always the same in its intention, to keep you small, manageable, digestible. You might carry the script of invisibility. If I stay quiet, I won't be rejected. Or the script of perfectionism. If I do everything right, maybe I'll finally be enough. or the script of caretaking. If I make sure everyone's okay, they won't leave. None of these thoughts sound like shame, but they are, because underneath each one is the same conclusion. I am not okay as I am. Where do these scripts come from? Sometimes from words, sometimes from silence. A parent who only praised you when you achieved. A home where emotions weren't safe. A community where difference meant danger. Or simply moments, tiny, forgettable moments that quietly taught your nervous system that being yourself was risky. So you adjusted, you edited, you got smaller, and the world called it maturity, called it humility, called it resilience. But it was shame, disguised as character. The hardest thing about shame scripts is that they don't feel like lies. They feel like rules. And when you try to break them, when you speak up, or rest, or say no, or ask for more, you don't feel free. You feel guilt. You feel danger. You feel like you're doing something wrong. Because the shame script was designed to protect you from rejection, and now it punishes you for outgrowing it. So how do you unwrite it? You don't shout over it. You don't argue with it. You sit with it. And you ask, who gave this to me? Who benefits when I believe this? Who taught me I had to shrink in order to be loved? And then you ask something harder. What would happen if I stopped believing it? What would happen if I believed that I could take up space and still be safe? That I could be seen and still be chosen? That I could be fully myself and nothing bad would happen? That I could just exist without apology? And yes, at first it will feel wrong, because shame is a habit, a rhythm your body learned to survive. But you are not who the script says you are. You are not a burden. You are not too much. You are not hard to love. You are not the reason they left. You are not the flaw. You are the one who carried too much for too long without being asked what it cost you. But once the shame begins to soften, something else rises, a deeper, quieter ache, not from what you believe, but from who you've had to become in order to keep believing it. And that is the pain we begin to touch next. Who would I be without this pain? Pain becomes familiar, not just in the way it hurts, but in the way it holds you, like a coat that never quite fit. But you've worn it for so long you forget what it felt like to be cold without it. You begin to wrap yourself in it, not because you enjoy the ache, but because it became home. And if you take it off, if you let it go, you're left with something even harder to carry. The question, then who am I? We talk about healing like it's a destination, like it's a goal you reach by pushing through the pain, by working hard, by being brave enough to let go. But we don't always talk about what comes after letting go. The silence, the unfamiliar space, the loss of the identity you built around your ability to survive. Because that's what pain can become, a story, a definition, a name. Not because you wanted it, but because you didn't know you were allowed to be someone else. When people see you, they see strength, resilience, endurance, discipline, control. But they don't always see what those things were protecting. The tenderness, the fear, the aching parts that never got to speak because the pain spoke louder. And over time, you forget them too, because your story became about the hurt, and the hurt became about who you are. So now, as things begin to shift, as the ache loosens, as your body begins to trust that maybe, just maybe, you're not in danger anymore, a strange emotion begins to surface, not peace, not joy, but grief. Grief for the version of you who carried it all. Grief for the one who wasn't allowed to rest. grief for the identity you had to build just to be safe enough to exist. Because if I'm not the strong one anymore, then what am I? If I'm not the one who always holds it together, then who holds me? If I'm not the one who suffers in silence, then what do I have to offer? If the pain disappears, so does the narrative. And that silence can be terrifying. Pain gives you something to hold on to. It explains the distance. It justifies the fear. It makes sense of the walls. It gives you a reason to stay small without having to say why. It is the permission to not be vulnerable. And when healing begins, that permission slips away. You're suddenly allowed to be soft, allowed to speak, allowed to trust, allowed to receive. And that's terrifying too, because softness is not what you trained for. Sometimes we don't fear healing because it's hard. We fear it because it means we're no longer who we used to be. And when identity is fused with struggle, letting go of the struggle feels like losing yourself. So we hold on to the pain, to the story, to the familiar ache that reminds us we're still us, even when that ache no longer serves us. But what if you are not the hurt, not the wound, not the survivor, not the fixer, not the mask that kept you safe? What if those were just shapes you took when the world didn't offer you another one? What if healing isn't about becoming someone else, but remembering someone you've always been beneath the pain? That version of you doesn't need to prove anything, doesn't need to protect everyone, doesn't need to explain their fear in exchange for compassion. That version just wants to rest, to be, to take up space without the narrative that says you have to suffer to matter. And you might not know how to meet that self yet, but you can feel them in the moments when you're not fighting, in the quiet between the flashbacks, in the gentleness that returns when the armor slips. Letting go of pain isn't just about releasing the past. It's about stepping into a life you never had time to imagine. A life where love doesn't feel like danger, where peace doesn't feel suspicious, where you don't have to choose between connection and authenticity, where you are no longer defined by what hurt you, but by what you choose now. But even in the softest healing, there's one final reflex, a whisper that rises just when you begin to feel safe. This is too easy. This isn't real. You don't get to be free. And that voice, the one that turns peace into fear, is the next distortion we begin to unlearn. When emotion feels like truth, emotional reasoning. Sometimes you don't believe something because it's logical. You believe it because it feels true. I feel ashamed, so I must have done something wrong. I feel rejected, so they must not care. I feel hopeless, so nothing will ever get better. It's not a thought. It's not a memory. It's not even a belief. It's a feeling. And feelings don't ask for permission. They just show up and sit at the center of everything. This is emotional reasoning. The belief that if something feels real, then it is real. That discomfort equals danger. That fear equals fact. That sadness equals failure. That anxiety means you're in the wrong place with the wrong people doing the wrong thing. And when your body says it that loudly, how could it not be true? How could it not be a warning? The thing is, emotional reasoning doesn't come from nowhere. It's born in environments where your feelings were never explained, only amplified. You weren't taught that emotions move. That fear doesn't always mean stop. That anger doesn't always mean wrong. That sadness doesn't always mean something is broken. Instead, your nervous system learned, if it feels bad, you are bad. If it hurts, it must be your fault. If you're scared, you need to run. And now, even years later, you don't trust the moment. You trust the feeling, even if the feeling lies. Emotional reasoning doesn't ask, what else could this mean? It declares, I feel unsafe. Therefore I am. I feel unworthy. therefore I am. I feel forgotten, therefore no one cares. And that declaration becomes a lens. You stop checking the facts. You stop questioning the voice. You just follow the emotion like it's a compass leading you deeper into the very place you've been trying to escape. It's not your fault. When you grow up navigating unpredictable love, conditional safety, emotional inconsistency, your body doesn't need evidence. It needs patterns. So it learns discomfort means danger, confusion means guilt, vulnerability means exposure, closeness means risk. And suddenly, every soft thing feels like a trick. Every calm moment feels like the setup before the storm. Every compliment feels like manipulation. Every opportunity feels like a test you're not ready for. And your feelings, instead of guiding you forward, keep you circling back into old wounds disguised as truth. So how do you untangle what you feel from what's real? You start with a pause, not to silence the feeling, but to question the conclusion. Not, this is wrong because I'm scared, but I notice I'm scared. What else might be happening? Not, this is doomed because I feel hopeless, but my nervous system is tired. Is that the same as a truth? You begin to separate the emotion from the evidence, not to dismiss your inner world, but to recognize that not all intensity equals accuracy. Feelings are messengers. They are not dictators. They ask for your attention, not your surrender. They're allowed to be heard. They're not always meant to be believed. Because the truth is, you can feel rejected and still be loved. You can feel unsafe and still be okay. You can feel hopeless and still be on the edge of something new. Emotional reasoning traps you not by creating pain, but by silencing everything except the pain. It turns one moment of emotion into a life sentence of meaning. But feelings are weather. They pass, they move, they shift. And when you learn to stay through the storm, not act on it, not obey it, just witness it, you begin to see something underneath. A place in you that doesn't change when the feelings do. A place that stays steady. Still. Here. You. But when you start to find that quiet place inside, the part untouched by panic or pressure, a new fear emerges. What if I can't trust myself anymore? Because when feelings ruled you, at least you knew what to believe. And that fear of losing even the distorted compass is what we begin to face next. The spotlight is always on me. Egocentric distortion. You walk into a room and suddenly you're aware of every movement. How you hold your hands, how your voice sounds, how your body takes up space. You imagine how they see you, what they might be thinking, what they've already decided. And even if no one looks your way, you still feel like every eye is watching. You're on a stage you never auditioned for, in a play you don't remember choosing, and it never ends. This is egocentric distortion, not in the selfish sense, not in the way people use the word casually, but in the psychological sense, where your mind places a spotlight on yourself, even when no one else is looking. It's the belief that you are the center of other people's perception, that your mistakes are magnified, that your awkwardness is unforgettable, that your every move is being recorded and evaluated, even when no one else remembers, even when they never noticed at all. This distortion doesn't come from arrogance. It comes from hypervigilance, when you've been criticized for just existing, when your worth felt conditional based on how perfect, quiet, useful, or pleasant you were. Your body learned to scan every moment for how it might be judged. You started to view yourself the way you feared others might. And now, even when no one's around, you carry the imaginary audience with you. You replay what you said. You regret how you laughed. You feel exposed, even in safe places, even in silence. Because when you grow up feeling like you were always one wrong move away from being punished, or embarrassed, or abandoned, your brain adapts by putting a camera on you at all times, just in case, just so you'll be ready, just so you can catch the mistake before someone else does. But the irony is, this spotlight doesn't protect you. It drains you. It makes connection feel dangerous. It makes vulnerability feel foolish. It makes joy feel suspicious. Because if you let your guard down, they'll see it, the flaw, the weirdness, the shame, and so you don't let it go. You don't speak too freely. You don't move too loosely. You don't let them see you until you've rehearsed the version that's safe. And even then, you feel like you got it wrong. But here's what you were never told. People aren't thinking about you as much as you think. Not because you don't matter, but because they're busy doing the same thing. Scanning themselves, worrying about how they sound, wondering how you see them. Most of the spotlight is imagined, projected, a mirror turned inward disguised as attention from others. So what do you do when your mind keeps putting you center stage? You don't try to erase the spotlight, you just move it. From judgment to curiosity, from shame to observation. What if they aren't judging me? What if they're just distracted? What if they're just living their lives? What if I'm not actually that important in their mental movie? What if I can step off the stage and still be safe? You don't need to disappear to feel okay. You just need to know you're not being watched the way you were trained to believe. You're not being scored. You're not being graded. You're not under attack. You are just here, with people who are also human, who are also worried about being enough. And when you realize that no one is keeping a tally, that no one remembers that awkward moment you can't stop replaying, you begin to relax. You breathe easier. You speak without rehearsing. You let your body take up space without apology. And suddenly you're not in the spotlight. You're in the room, present, unperforming, free. But just when that freedom begins to settle in, a new fear rises. If I stop trying to control how I'm seen, then how will I protect myself? And that fear of being visible without defense is the next place we begin to explore. If I can't control it, I can't survive it. There's a part of you that doesn't need things to go perfectly. It just needs them to be predictable. Because predictability feels safe, and unpredictability feels like danger, even when it isn't, even when nothing is actually wrong. The unknown isn't just uncomfortable, it feels like threat. This is control, not the kind people joke about, not being type A or needing your schedule to stay clean, but the deeper kind, the quiet kind, the kind born from chaos, the kind that forms in people who never had the luxury of trusting the moment. Because when life has taught you that anything can fall apart without warning, you start to believe that control is the only way to stay alive. You don't call it fear. You call it planning. You call it preparing. You call it being realistic. You rehearse conversations. You anticipate rejection. You scan for signs. You tighten your grip. And from the outside, you look calm, capable, collected. But underneath, your mind is racing to hold everything in place, because if you can predict it, you can avoid it. If you can prevent it, you won't be blindsided. If you can stay one step ahead, you won't have to feel helpless again. This isn't about being a perfectionist. It's about survival. Somewhere along the line, you learned that bad things happen when you're not paying attention. That stillness equals risk. That rest equals exposure. That trusting someone else means giving them the power to break you. And you promised yourself you'd never be caught off guard again. So you became the one who anticipates everything, even the pain that never arrives. But here's the thing about control. It doesn't protect you from pain. It just isolates you from peace. It keeps you alert. It keeps you performing. It keeps you running simulations in your mind about things that may never happen. It costs you the moment you're in, because you're busy trying to manage the next one, and it convinces you that anxiety is the same thing as readiness. But it's not. So how do you let go when everything in you says, if I don't hold it together, everything will fall apart? You start by naming the cost. What is this control costing you? Sleep? Presence? Connection? Joy? Is the safety worth the solitude? Is the certainty worth the chronic tension in your chest? Is the plan worth never feeling free? Letting go of control doesn't mean becoming reckless. It means making space for reality, for the truth that life has always been uncontrollable. You just stopped noticing because you were too busy trying to outmaneuver it. But control isn't safety. Control is a performance of safety. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is whisper, I don't know what's going to happen, but I'll still be here when it does. That's not giving up. That's healing. It's making peace with the storm without needing to be the sky. It's letting the conversation unfold without rehearsing every line. It's letting the silence breathe without assuming it means rejection. It's allowing life to move and trusting that you will move with it. But just when you begin to unclench, just when your grip loosens, another part of you whispers, if I stop controlling everything, what if they finally see how broken I really am? And that fear of being seen without the mask is what we step into next. They must think I'm weak, the fear of being seen. There's a moment, right after the mask slips, right after you say too much, or cry in front of someone, or don't hold it together the way you usually do. And then it hits, the spiral, the inner recoil, the voice that says, they must think I'm weak. You don't know what they're thinking, but you assume the worst, not because you don't trust them, but because you don't trust what they'll see when they look at you. This is the fear of being seen, not admired, not praised, not noticed from afar, but truly seen in your most human form, the unfiltered version, the one who struggles, who gets messy, who doesn't always know what to say. And for some reason, that version feels like a threat, like a liability, like something to hide, even when no one's judging you, even when the room is kind. Because when you've spent years performing strength, carrying pain in silence, and proving your worth by never needing help, vulnerability doesn't feel freeing. It feels exposed, uncontrolled, like a window you forgot to close before the storm. You were raised on the myth that strength means invincibility. That needing anything makes you dependent. That softening makes you small. So even now, when someone leans in, when someone says, I see you, your whole body wants to disappear. You've learned to protect yourself by preemptively hiding, by answering I'm fine before they ask, by changing the subject when things get too real, by laughing when you actually want to cry, because being seen means being known, and being known means being at risk. What if they don't like what they find? What if they pity you? What if they leave? But here's the part your fear never tells you. Being seen isn't what breaks us. Being unseen does. Being unseen while pretending you're okay. Being unseen when you needed help. Being unseen in your truth, your sorrow, your softness. That's the wound that shaped you. And now, every time someone offers to see you, really see you, it touches that old scar. And your mind panics because it thinks it's happening again. So how do you step into visibility without shutting down? You start small. You don't bear it all at once. You offer slivers, pieces, moments. You let someone sit with you in silence without feeling like you need to perform. You admit, I don't have the words right now, and notice that the world doesn't end. You say, I feel vulnerable, and watch how the room softens instead of turning away. You learn, slowly, that being real doesn't cost you connection. Sometimes it creates it. Because strength was never about invisibility. It was never about how well you hide. It was never about how tightly you hold it in. True strength is allowing yourself to exist as you are, messy, confused, tender, changing, and still worthy of being held. But just when you begin to trust that maybe you can be seen and still be loved, still be safe, another old belief slips in. I should be over this by now. And that quiet self-judgment, that timeline you never agreed to, is the next distortion we untangle. I should be over this by now. The myth of emotional deadlines. You wake up and for a moment, everything's still, but then it returns. That ache, that memory, that quiet heaviness you thought you were done feeling, and before you even fully breathe, the judgment arrives too. Still? Again? I should be over this by now. Not because someone said it, but because somewhere along the way, you learned there's a limit to how long you're allowed to grieve something no one else can see anymore. This is the myth of emotional deadlines. The belief that pain has a schedule, that healing follows a timeline, that growth happens cleanly, linearly, and in private. And if it doesn't, if you still feel the thing long after it's supposed to be gone, then something must be wrong with you. But healing was never a straight line. It's a spiral, a loop, a cycle. You think you've made it through until something pulls you back, not to punish you, but to show you something deeper, to ask, are you ready to hold this part now? The one you couldn't face last time? This isn't failure. This is return. This is repair. This is remembering. Still, your mind doesn't like it. It says, you're too old to still be this hurt. You should have figured this out by now. Other people have been through worse. You should be stronger. And you believe it. Because shame wears a watch. It keeps time on how long you've been sad, how long you've been anxious, how long you've needed what others seem to live without. And the longer it goes, the louder that clock ticks inside you. But no one tells you there is no clock. There is no right moment to be done grieving, no official milestone that makes your pain less valid, no finish line that makes you healed enough. What happened to you didn't happen on a schedule, so why would your healing follow one? Emotions don't expire. They unfold. They resurface. They reintroduce themselves when you're safe enough to hold them better. And you're allowed to be right where you are, even now, even still. The truth is, most of the pressure to move on isn't yours. It was taught, modeled, handed to you by a world uncomfortable with what takes time, a world that celebrates progress but rushes past process, a world that sees wounds and wants them sealed, fast, quietly, privately. But some wounds don't vanish. They soften. They change shape. They integrate. They stop defining you, but they don't disappear on demand. So what do you do when healing takes longer than expected? You breathe. You ground. You name the truth. I am not behind. I am just human. And sometimes you stop asking, why is this still here? And start asking, how can I be with it differently now? That shift, from fixing to relating, is where healing deepens. Because healing isn't about erasing pain. It's about building a relationship with it that no longer controls you. It's about seeing an old feeling and not shrinking from it, not judging it, not rushing it, just saying, I know you. You can stay if you need to. You're not my enemy anymore. But right when you begin to feel peace with your pace, The part of you that still measures worth by progress whispers again, "But what if I never fully heal?" And that fear of being forever unfinished is where we go next. I always ruin everything. Identity fused with failure. It starts as a memory, then it becomes a pattern, and eventually it becomes you. The mistakes, the missteps, the things you wish you'd done differently. They stop being things that happened and start being proof of who you are. I ruin things, not just once, but always. Not just in moments, but in your identity. This is what happens when failure stops being an event and starts being a mirror. You don't just remember what went wrong, you carry it, like a scar carved into your self-concept, like a secret tattoo no one else can see. So every time something good appears, you wait, not in hope, but in anticipation. When will I mess this up? How long until I disappoint them? How long until they see I was never enough to begin with? And the worst part is, you don't even have to ruin anything. You just expect to. So you overthink, overcompensate, over-apologize. You become careful to the point of distance, self-sabotaging just to get it over with. Because if it's going to fall apart, you'd rather be the one to break it than wait to be broken by it. This is what shame does when it becomes fused with identity. It convinces you that your past defines your future, that patterns are prophecies, that one mistake means you are a mistake. So you replay your wrongs like they're evidence in a case you're always losing. You don't need critics. You've already internalized the voice. See? You did it again. But here's the truth that fear won't let you hold. Failing at something doesn't mean you are a failure. Breaking something doesn't mean you're broken. Messing up doesn't mean you were never worthy of it. You are not the worst thing you've ever done. You are not the sum of the things that fell apart. And even if the world walked away when you made a mistake, that doesn't mean you deserve to be abandoned. It just means you've never been loved by someone who stayed and saw you as still good. Healing this isn't about erasing your past. It's about reclaiming your self-worth from the stories your pain wrote without your permission. It's about untangling your identity from your history. So you can finally say, I did that, and I'm still allowed to grow. I made a mistake, and I'm still worthy of repair. I hurt someone, but I'm not just hurtful. I'm human. Because you don't have to carry failure like it's your name. You don't have to walk into every room assuming you're the problem. You don't have to love others by punishing yourself first. You are allowed to learn, to get it wrong, to try again. You are allowed to outgrow the version of you who didn't know better. And you are allowed to believe in the version of you who will do better next time. But even as you start to soften that voice, even as you begin to separate what happened from who you are, another fear quietly rises. What if they saw the real me, the full, unfiltered version, and walked away anyway? And that fear of being known and still abandoned is where we go next. If they knew the real me, they'd leave you smile. You show up. You say the right things. You keep things light, not because you're fake, but because you're terrified of being seen. Not the version of you they admire, not the one who's put together, but the one underneath, the part of you that flinches when someone gets too close, the part that believes closeness always comes with a cost. You hide that part, not because it's shameful, but because you've never known what it feels like for someone to see it and stay. This is the fear of being known, not just known casually, but deeply, intimately, truthfully. And it's not because you've done something terrible. It's not because you're bad. It's because somewhere along the way, you learned that love is fragile. That connection is conditional. That acceptance only lasts as long as the mask stays on, so you keep performing, smiling through the ache, nodding through the discomfort, keeping quiet when you want to scream, because letting someone all the way in feels like handing them a weapon they don't know they're holding. And you've been cut before, by people who said, "I want to know you," but only meant the version that made them comfortable. By people who walked away not because you did something wrong, but because they finally saw you weren't perfect. So now you keep it safe, controlled, curated, because if you never let them in fully, they can't fully reject you, right? But here's the paradox. The more you hide, the more alone you feel, even when you're surrounded, even when they say they care, even when they reach for you, because you know deep down, they don't love you. They love the performance, the filtered version, the one who never needs too much, and the part of you that wants to be loved for who you really are never stops aching. So what would happen if you showed them? Not all at once, not everything, just one honest moment, a truth, a need, a fear, a story you've always carried in silence. And what if they didn't leave? What if they leaned in closer? What if they said, "I still see you. I still want to know you"? What if they didn't flinch? That moment, that pause where someone stays, it doesn't erase the fear, but it gives you something else. A new data point, a new possibility, a crack in the belief that you are unlovable in your rawness. Because the truth is, you don't need everyone to stay. You just need to stop abandoning yourself before anyone else gets the chance to. You don't need to be perfect to be chosen. You need to be real to be free. And the more you practice honesty, the more you learn. Those who leave aren't rejecting the real you. They're just not meant for the version of you that finally stopped pretending. But even as you let someone see you, even as their presence doesn't break the moment, another fear creeps in. If I'm not fighting something, if I'm not struggling, then who am I? And that quiet identity crisis, the ache of not knowing yourself without the pain, is where we go next. I don't know who I am without the struggle. You've spent years surviving, pushing through, getting by, holding it all together when everything wanted to fall apart. You became the fighter, the strong one, the one who never let it break you, at least not on the outside. And now that the chaos is quiet and your world is no longer burning, you feel lost, not relieved, not free, but disoriented, because struggle was never just what you endured. It was how you knew yourself. This is what happens when your identity fuses with pain. You begin to define yourself by what you've had to overcome. You know how to fight. You know how to carry. You know how to endure. But rest, softness, ease, those feel foreign, almost threatening, like a void you don't know how to fill. Because if you're not in survival mode, who are you? No one talks about this part of healing, the grief of letting go of the struggle, the emptiness that comes not from pain, but from its absence. Because when you're no longer putting out fires, you're left sitting in silence with someone you don't fully recognize, yourself. And maybe for the first time, you're not sure what you like, what you want, what you even need, because all you've ever needed was to survive. And now, you have to learn how to live. But here's the truth. Your value was never in your pain, not in your trauma, not in your endurance, not in your scars. You are not impressive because of what you've been through. You are worthy even if you've never suffered again. But when pain was your compass, healing can feel like losing your map. And that's okay, because now you get to write a new one. It starts slow, small, sometimes painfully uncertain, trying new things, noticing what feels good instead of just what feels necessary, letting joy in without waiting for the punishment, letting peace land without preparing for it to be taken, letting yourself be without needing to justify your existence through pain. And maybe you still ache, maybe you still feel the pull to go back to struggle, just to feel like yourself again. But you don't have to answer that pull. You can pause, you can breathe, you can say, I'm learning who I am when I'm not hurting. I'm discovering the version of me that's allowed to feel safe. I'm building an identity not rooted in survival, but in becoming. Because the end of struggle is not the end of you. It's the beginning of everything you've never let yourself have. And just when you begin to feel a glimpse of wholeness, a different voice creeps in. But what if every moment is a test? What if I let go too much and fail again? And that unspoken pressure to always perform, always prove, is where we go next. Everything feels like a test. Chronic performance mode. You wake up tired, not just physically but emotionally. Before your feet touch the ground, you're already bracing to prove, to perfect, to be what the world expects, not because you crave praise, but because you fear what silence might mean. Because in your world, every moment feels like a test. Every interaction is a hidden evaluation. Every mistake is evidence that you've fallen behind, that you've lost your worth. This is chronic performance mode, the quiet panic of needing to be on at all times, not to impress but to survive. Because somewhere along the way, you learn that being lovable isn't a birthright, it's a condition, something to be earned, maintained, protected at all costs. So you learn to perform, for safety, for stability, for a sense of identity that felt just solid enough to carry you through the day. And the performance? It works. On the surface, you're competent, reliable, put together. You make people comfortable. You anticipate needs before they're spoken. You over-deliver. You say yes when you want to say, please, not today. You hold it all so no one sees you fall apart. Because falling apart feels like failure, and failure, to a person fused with performance, feels like being unworthy of love. So you stay in motion. You measure your value in output. You feel safe when you're needed. You confuse exhaustion with accomplishment. And when you're not being productive, when you're not excelling, when you're not useful, you feel invisible, or worse, like a burden. So you keep doing. You keep proving. You keep showing up with a full plate and an empty heart. But here's the paradox. The more you perform, the more disconnected you become. From your body, from your wants, from your needs. Because chronic performance requires you to abandon yourself daily, in tiny, invisible ways. You stop asking, what do I need? And start asking, what do they want from me? You stop wondering, what feels good? And start calculating, what will make me enough today? And the deeper truth is this. No amount of performance can make up for a lack of self-connection. No external validation can fill the space left empty by your own absence. You can be praised, rewarded, even loved, and still feel hollow because you've learned to show the world only a version of you that you no longer recognize. But what if you stopped performing? What if you risked not being impressive? What if you let yourself be seen in your rawness, your stillness, your humanness? It might feel like weakness at first, like you're giving up, like you've stopped trying. But really, you're beginning something new. You're beginning to trust that you're allowed to just be, not because you've done something extraordinary, but because you exist, because the worth you've been trying to prove was always yours to begin with. And yes, not everyone will understand. Some people loved your performance more than they ever loved your presence. Some people will leave when the applause stops, but those aren't your people. the ones who stay, who see you beneath the act and choose you anyway. They're the ones you were trying to find all along. So breathe. Let the need to impress soften. Let the urge to outperform pause. Let the you behind the mask step forward. You are not a constant test. You are not an endless audition. You are not a machine built to serve the expectations of others. You are a person, software messy, brave, and you deserve to rest in your own enoughness. But just as that idea begins to settle, as you let go of the performance and step into presence, another question stirs in the quiet. If I finally slow down, if I let myself feel safe, what if it all falls apart? And that quiet fear of peace itself, of letting your guard down, is where we go next. I can't trust peace. The fear of letting your guard down. You've been holding tension for so long, you've forgotten what it feels like not to. The world finally quiets down. Nothing's chasing you. No one's angry. No alarms ringing in your chest. But instead of resting, you freeze. Instead of exhaling, you scan. Because somewhere deep inside, your body learned a rule it never forgot. When things feel calm, something bad is about to happen. This is what trauma does. It teaches you that safety is temporary, that stillness is suspicious, that softness is the moment right before the cut. And so, peace becomes the scariest part, not because it hurts, but because it might. Because the higher you climb into calm, the farther you'll fall when it ends. And so you learn, don't climb, stay close to the ground, stay guarded, stay prepared, because disappointment is easier when you've already expected it. So even in the best moments, a loving gaze, a quiet morning, a day without panic, you brace, you distract yourself, you look for flaws, you make up problems just to feel more in control, because joy feels like a trap, and ease feels like a setup, and even as life softens, you can't, because letting go means being vulnerable, and vulnerability to you was never safe. You weren't born this way. You were trained by the people who exploded without warning, by the warmth that turned cold without explanation, by the moments of hope that were followed by pain so sharp it made you vow, never again. So you built your armor, not out of steel, but hypervigilance. You became the one who always notices too much, who always plans for the worst, who always walks through good moments with one eye on the exit. And you survived. But surviving is not the same as living. Peace is not the enemy. It's just unfamiliar. And unfamiliar doesn't mean unsafe. It just means your nervous system hasn't learned it yet. It just means you're standing in the doorway of something new, and your body is remembering every time new used to mean danger. But not this time. This time, peace might actually be peace. And that is terrifying in a way most people will never understand. Because when your identity was built in the fire of survival, softness feels like erasure. You wonder, who am I if I'm not defending myself? Who am I if I'm not the strong one? Who am I if I finally let go? And in that moment, you realize something even deeper. You've never learned how to exist without something to fight. You've never had to define yourself by joy, by presence, by play, by simply being allowed to exhale without consequence. But now, you get to try. Not all at once, not forever, but one moment at a time, one safe breath, one relaxed shoulder, one quiet evening where you don't have to look over your own emotional shoulder. This is what healing becomes in its gentlest form. The nervous system learning, very slowly, that not every pause is a threat, that not every silence means danger, that not every good thing needs to be ruined just to feel safe again. You are not wrong for struggling to trust peace. You are not broken because comfort makes you uneasy. You are just someone who learned to survive in war and is now waking up in a field where the war has ended. But your body still wears the armor. You are not late. You are learning how to put the shield down without losing yourself. You are discovering that safety isn't the absence of fear. It's the return of choice. The choice to stay. The choice to rest. The choice to trust that maybe, just maybe, you deserve to feel okay. Not because you earned it. Not because you passed the test. But because you are here. And that is enough. And as we leave this chapter behind, this long, aching chapter of performance, distortion, and self-protection, a quiet whisper stirs at the edges of your awareness. If I am not my fear, not my shame, not my story, then who am I? And that question, that invitation to meet yourself beyond your thoughts, is where we go next. What if my thoughts are lying to me? It's a quiet whisper at first. Something small. Something that slips in under the surface. They don't actually like you. You're not ready for this. You're going to fail, just like last time. And before you know it, it's not just a thought. It's a belief. Because it feels so familiar. It sounds so certain. It carries the weight of past experiences, as if it's only there to protect you from getting hurt again. And so, you don't question it. You don't stop to ask, wait, is this even true? Because you're too busy treating it like truth. But what if it's not? What if your thoughts aren't telling you the whole story? What if that inner voice isn't your wisdom, but your fear? What if the things you tell yourself are not facts, but echoes? Echoes of past rejections, echoes of old criticism, echoes of moments when it felt safer to assume the worst than to hope for something better. Your mind doesn't mean to lie. It's trying to protect you. It's trying to keep you from taking risks that might lead to disappointment. But in doing so, it builds a story that's more about survival than truth. And that story repeats over and over because the brain loves patterns, even painful ones, even the ones that keep you small. And so you think, if I feel anxious, then something must be wrong. If I feel unwanted, then I must be unlovable. If I feel scared, then I must not be ready. These thoughts seem so real because they're tied to feelings, and feelings, especially big, loud ones, can drown out everything else. But just because a thought feels true doesn't mean it is true. It just means it's practiced. It just means you've heard it before. It just means your brain has spent a long time building that track, and now it plays on repeat. So what can you do when your thoughts feel like lies, but sound like facts? You start with curiosity. Not judgment, not rejection, just a quiet moment of asking, where did this thought come from? What is it trying to protect me from? Does it really fit my life now? Or is it just a story from before? When you ask these questions, you begin to see the cracks, the places where the thought doesn't quite align with reality, the ways it might be holding you back instead of holding you safe. You don't have to fight your thoughts. You don't have to push them away. You don't have to label them as bad. You just have to notice them. Notice the ones that loop. Notice the ones that show up only when you're about to take a risk. Notice the ones that sound like someone else's voice. A parent, a teacher, an old friend who left a scar. When you notice them, you begin to create space. A moment of pause. A gap between hearing and believing. Because you are not the voice in your head. You are the awareness that hears it. You are the one who can sit quietly and watch it pass, like a cloud in the sky without chasing it down or pulling it closer. You can say, I see you, I hear you, but I don't have to be you. And as you do, the grip loosens, the thought loses its power. It doesn't disappear, but it no longer dictates who you are or what you can become. This is where freedom begins, not by silencing your thoughts, but by remembering that you've never been bound by them. They were loud, they were persistent, but they were never you. And now, as you sit with that awareness, as you start to untangle your truth from the stories your mind has told, you begin to wonder, if this voice was never really mine, then who am I beneath it all? And that question, the search for the you that was always there, even beneath the noise, is where we go next. The inner critic isn't always yours. There's a voice in your mind. It doesn't shout. It doesn't need to. You know it so well you barely notice it anymore. It speaks in statements, not questions. You're so dramatic. You're being too sensitive. Of course you messed it up again. No one's ever really going to stay. You call it being realistic. You think of it as tough love. You convince yourself it's the part of you that keeps you humble, grounded, prepared. But what if it's not you at all? The inner critic didn't arrive out of nowhere. You weren't born with it. You learned it, piece by piece, word by word, tone by tone. From the sigh in someone's voice when you asked for too much. From the silence after you cried. From the sharp look when you showed joy too loudly. You watched, you listened, you absorbed, and eventually you began to repeat it to yourself so that no one else would have to. That's what the inner critic becomes, a preemptive strike, a defense mechanism disguised as self-awareness. If you criticize yourself first, it won't hurt as much when they do. If you beat yourself to the punch, no one can knock you down. If you believe you're hard to love, you won't be shocked when someone leaves. It's brilliant in its own way. Your mind adapted to emotional pain by trying to outrun it. But in doing so, it built a prison and called it protection. And now, even in safe places, the voice still speaks. You receive kindness, and the voice says, don't get used to it. You express a need, and it whispers, you're too much. You succeed, and it leans in with, just wait, you'll screw it up. This isn't realism, it's repetition, and it's not your voice. It's an echo of someone else's discomfort projected onto your worth. So here's the quiet rebellion. You begin to question the voice. You ask it, who taught you to speak to me this way? And slowly, you start to notice something strange. It sounds like your mother's disapproval, your father's coldness, the teacher who said you weren't special, the friend who made love feel like a competition. These are not your words. These are emotional recordings, and you have the right to press stop. Your inner world doesn't have to run on old programming. You can interrupt the voice. You can meet it with gentleness. You can replace criticism with curiosity. Instead of, what's wrong with me? You ask, where did I learn to see myself this way? Instead of, why can't I just be better? You ask, who taught me that my worth was conditional? This is where healing begins. Not in silencing the voice completely, but in recognizing you don't have to believe it anymore. The inner critic will still visit, but now you'll know. You are not required to invite it in. You don't have to let it sit at the table. You don't have to make space for a voice that never made space for you. You get to build something else now. A quieter voice, a warmer one. One that says, you didn't ruin everything. You're still learning. You're allowed to grow without being perfect first. And as you begin to make room for that softer truth, you may notice something even subtler. Some of your deepest fears don't shout at all. They wear the mask of logic, They sound reasonable, practical, even wise. But underneath, they're just fear in disguise. And that voice, the one pretending to protect you with facts, is where we go next. How fear masquerades as logic. You don't think of it as fear. Not at first. You call it being careful. You say you're just being realistic. You think, I'm not afraid, I'm just prepared. And that's how fear slips in. Not as panic, not as terror, but as logic, as reason, as caution wrapped in confidence, as the voice that sounds calm while quietly building a prison around your possibilities. It doesn't scream, it calculates. What if this doesn't work? What if they think you're not good enough? What if you get rejected? What if this is just like last time? And because it's not loud, because it sounds smart, you listen, you follow it, you adjust your plans, you shrink your dreams until they feel safe enough, and you convince yourself that you're being responsible. But really, you're just staying small in a way that feels justified. Because fear knows if it shouts, you'll recognize it. But if it uses the voice of reason, if it wraps itself in logic and strategy and planning, you'll think it's helping you. You'll think it's wisdom. But it's not. It's avoidance. It's self-doubt in disguise. It's your past pain pretending to be foresight. You start to make decisions not based on possibility, but on prediction. Not on what you want, but on what you fear could happen if you let yourself want it too much. You overthink every risk. You undercut every dream. You don't leap unless you've measured the landing 100 times. And even then, you might not jump. Because somewhere deep inside, you've started to believe that the worst thing that could happen is to try and fail. But the deeper truth is this: the worst thing that could happen is to never try at all. So how do you tell the difference between real logic and fear in disguise? You check the tone. Logic says, here are the possibilities. Fear says, here's everything that could go wrong. Logic says, let's make a thoughtful decision. Fear says, let's not do anything until we're sure we won't be hurt. Logic feels grounding. Fear feels tightening. Logic invites clarity. Fear demands control. And the hardest part? Fear that masquerades as logic often comes from people you trust. The parent who told you not to dream too big. The teacher who said you weren't ready yet. The friend who wanted to protect you by reminding you to be realistic. They weren't trying to hurt you. They were speaking from their own fear. And now, that fear lives inside you, dressed up as maturity, dressed up as knowing better. But you can know better than that. You can ask, is this thought guiding me or guarding me? Is this caution or conditioning? Is this a boundary or a fear pretending to be one? And when you start to see it, when you recognize the costume fear wears, you can choose differently. You can feel afraid and still move forward. You can hear the voice and still take the leap. You can acknowledge the risk and still believe in the possibility. Because freedom isn't the absence of fear. It's the refusal to be ruled by it. And just when you begin to see how fear plays dress up in your mind, another realization begins to surface. If fear can sound like logic, then maybe control can feel like safety, even when it's slowly suffocating me. And that delicate line between structure and obsession, between order and over-control, is where we go next. When control becomes a religion. At first, it looks like discipline, like structure, like wisdom. You plan ahead, you double-check, you make sure everyone's okay. You play out every scenario in your mind just to be ready. And on the surface, it feels like a strength. But underneath, it's not about staying ahead. It's about staying safe. Because somewhere along the way, you learned that when things are out of control, people get hurt, people leave, things break. So you became the one who would never let that happen again. Control stopped being a strategy. It became a belief system, a rule book, a ritual, a sacred contract with your nervous system that says, if I do everything right, nothing bad will happen. It's quiet, but absolute. And when it gets threatened, you don't just feel inconvenience. You feel panic because control became your God and chaos became your hell. You start micromanaging everything, not just the world around you, but yourself, your tone of voice, your facial expressions, the pace at which you reply to a message, the way you prepare for every conversation like it's a final exam. You start needing others to be predictable because unpredictability feels dangerous, not uncomfortable, but unsafe. You call it being careful, but what it really is fear, wrapped in rituals. But control is tricky. It never truly satisfies, because no matter how perfect you are, how prepared you stay, how much effort you pour into keeping everything in line, something always slips. Someone cancels, a plan falls through, an emotion rises that doesn't fit. And when it does, you don't just feel frustrated. You feel like the foundation of your world is shaking beneath you. Because when control is the only thing holding you together, its absence feels like collapse. So, what's underneath the need to control? Loss, abandonment, the memory of what happened when no one was paying attention, the silence after someone let go, the wreckage after someone made a careless decision you had to clean up. Control became your way of making sure you'd never feel that powerless again. But here's the paradox. The more you try to control everything, the more out of control you feel inside. Because life is not a system you can master. People are not equations. Emotions are not meant to be optimized. You are not a machine. And healing is not a checklist. You don't have to earn safety through exhaustion. You don't have to prevent every worst-case scenario to deserve peace. You can loosen your grip without losing yourself. You can let things unfold without assuming they'll fall apart. You can begin to trust that you will survive the unknown. Not because it's perfect, but because you're learning to be present inside it. And maybe control still whispers, "Don't let go." Something bad will happen if you do. But now you can whisper back, "Maybe something good will happen if I don't hold so tight." You don't have to believe the old religion anymore. You can build a new one where softness is holy, where surrender is sacred, where staying human is more important than staying perfect. And just when you feel the tiniest space open inside, a small gap between gripping and grounding, another thought arises. If I've questioned the stories, challenged the fears, released the control, then why does the voice in my head still feel like truth? And that voice, the narrator that's been guiding your every moment, is where we go next. The voice that narrates your life isn't always right. There's a voice inside your head. It's always there, from the moment you wake up to the moment you try to fall asleep. It fills in the gaps between events. It explains things. It draws conclusions. It connects dots that maybe were never connected at all. It tells you stories about who you are, what others think of you, what certain silences mean, what that one look from someone else surely implied. And most of the time, you don't question it, because it doesn't sound dramatic. It sounds convincing. It sounds logical. It sounds like you. But here's the thing. That voice isn't you. It's your narrator, the storyteller in your mind who's been trying to make sense of your life since the beginning. But instead of just observing the world, it explains the world. And it doesn't always explain it kindly. You didn't get a response because they're tired of you. You failed at that because you're not good enough. They laughed because they were making fun of you. The voice doesn't present options, it presents conclusions. And the more you hear it, the more you believe it. Not because it's true, but because it's familiar. Where did this narrator come from? You built it. Out of experience, out of trauma, out of small moments you didn't fully understand as a child. You built it to feel like you had control, to make life predictable, to keep yourself prepared for whatever might come next. If the narrator says you're not enough and someone leaves, you feel protected because at least you saw it coming. At least it wasn't a surprise. But what if your narrator is biased? What if it has a limited perspective? What if it's filtering everything you experience through an outdated lens? Because it was built to make meaning out of pain. It was shaped during times when you needed explanation more than truth, when you needed something to blame, when you needed to understand, even if that understanding made you the villain of your own story. So you started narrating your life like someone always on the brink of rejection, like someone who ruins things, like someone too sensitive, too needy, too much. You called it realism, but it was just repetition. The same story, told over and over again, until it stopped sounding like a story and started sounding like identity. But it's not. It's a script, and scripts can be rewritten. The first step is noticing the narration, noticing how your mind jumps to explain, how it fills in blanks, how it creates meanings where none were given. Then you pause. You ask, is that the only possible explanation? Is that fact or just fear? Would I speak to a friend the way this voice speaks to me? When you do that, you begin to see the narrator for what it is, not your truth, but your habit, not your reality, but your lens. You don't have to get rid of the voice. You just don't have to follow it blindly anymore. You can become the editor. You can listen with awareness, with distance, with curiosity. You can say, "Thank you for trying to keep me safe, but I'm writing this part differently." And in that moment, you don't erase your past. You reclaim your present. You give yourself the power to see what's happening without being told what it means. Because the voice in your head is not always accurate, not always kind, not always useful. But you are wiser now. You are the one listening. And that means you get to choose which stories continue. And just as you begin to loosen your grip on the narrator's version of your life, you might wake up one morning in a heavy fog of feeling, and that mood, that emotional weather that makes you think something must be wrong, is where we go next. You are not the mood. You wake up. In some mornings, the weight is already there. You open your eyes, and the heaviness greets you before the world does. You don't know where it came from. There's no clear reason. Nothing dramatic happened. No memory of a nightmare. No message that ruined your day. But still, you feel off. Like the day is already too much. Like something is wrong, even if you can't name what it is. And because it feels real, you assume it must be real. This is the trap. We believe our moods are telling us the truth. We think that if we wake up sad, it means something's broken. If we wake up anxious, it means something terrible is coming. If we wake up numb, it means we've lost ourselves. But your mood is not your reality. It's not your destiny. It's not even a reliable narrator. It's just weather, internal weather. And like the sky outside, it changes, whether you try to fix it or not. Mood is shaped by 1,000 invisible things. Your sleep, your hormones, your thoughts the night before, the temperature of the room, the echoes of old memories, even what you ate. But the mind doesn't like mystery. It wants reasons. So when you feel low, your brain starts scanning for proof, and it always finds something. It's because I'm falling behind. It's because they haven't replied. It's because I'm not good enough. Now your mood has a story. Now it feels justified. Now you're not just tired. You're failing. Not just heavy, but broken. But here's the truth. You are allowed to feel off without needing an explanation. You are allowed to feel sad without assuming it means something's wrong. You are allowed to feel flat without attaching meaning to it. You don't need to diagnose every feeling. You don't need to turn every emotion into a personal flaw. Some days the sky is just gray, and that's okay. You are not the cloud passing through you. You are the sky it passes through. You are not the sadness. You are the space that can hold it without collapsing under it. You are not the weight. You are the witness. And when you stop trying to analyze the weather, you allow it to move. So instead of asking, "What's wrong with me today?" try asking, "Can I be gentle with myself in this state?" Instead of rushing to feel better, ask, "What would feel comforting right now?" Not fixing, just holding. You are not required to be radiant every morning. You are not required to show up perfect. You are required to show up real. And real means change. Real means seasons. Real means being able to feel low without losing the bigger picture of who you are. So on days like these, when it feels like the colors drained out of the world, when your own mind feels like a foggy room, remember this. Moods are not mandates, feelings are not facts, and the weather will shift. Not because you forced it to, but because it always does. Let it move, let it soften, let it be what it is without turning it into who you are. And when the sky begins to clear, even just a little, you might remember something even truer. You are not your past either. Not what happened, not what was done to you, not the story you had to carry for so long just to survive. And that quiet separation between what shaped you and who you've always been is where we go next. You are not what happened to you. There are moments in your life you still don't talk about, not because you've forgotten them, but because they became too tangled with who you believe you are. The way someone spoke to you, the way something ended without warning, the way trust was broken, so quietly, so deeply, you didn't even realize how much of yourself you stopped bringing into the world. And now, there's a part of you that wonders, am I this way because of what happened? Or was I always like this? This is the confusion trauma leaves behind. Not just pain, but identity. You start confusing the adaptations for the original design. You think you're quiet because you're shy. Not because you learned that speaking up got you ignored. You think you're distant because you don't care. Not because closeness used to come with pain. You think you're broken because you still carry it. Not realizing that carrying it is what helped you survive. But surviving isn't the same as being. And now it's time to separate the two. You are not what happened to you. You are not the echo of someone else's choices. You are not defined by how they treated you when you were too young to know better. Yes, it shaped you. Yes, it left marks. But you are more than the blueprint of your survival. You are the builder now, and you get to decide what remains, what softens, what gets rewritten. This doesn't mean erasing the past. It means refusing to let it speak for you anymore. It means recognizing that your defense mechanisms were brilliant, but not always accurate. That the story you told yourself to make sense of the pain is not the story you have to live inside forever. It means giving yourself permission to become someone your trauma never gave you a chance to be. Because healing isn't becoming someone new. It's returning to someone ancient, someone who existed before the world taught you to be afraid of your own voice, your own needs, your own softness. It's not a transformation, it's a reunion. With the version of you who didn't have to be ready, didn't have to be perfect, didn't have to prove their worth through pain. And yes, you may still carry the scars, but now you carry them with awareness. They are not your shame. They are your reminders. You lived. You endured. You adapted. But now you're allowed to do more than survive. You're allowed to come home to yourself, to your laughter, to your stillness, to your unguarded breath. And as you begin to return, bit by bit, to the self beneath the story, another truth rises like a whisper. Maybe I'm not the person they remember. Maybe I never was. And maybe that's the beginning of something real. And that untangling from how others once saw you is where we go next. You are not the version of you they remember. There are people in your life who still talk to the version of you that no longer exists. They bring up old stories. They use old labels. They look at you with eyes that haven't updated in years. And even though you've grown quietly, painfully, deeply, something inside you shrinks when you're around them, because it's hard to become when people keep dragging you back to who you used to be. You try to speak differently, but they only hear what they expect. You try to set new boundaries, but they treat them like rebellion. You try to show up with your current self, but they respond to the echo of your past. And slowly, without realizing it, you start playing the role again. The role they wrote for you without ever asking if you wanted it. The helper, the quiet one, the troublemaker, the anxious one, the one who never had it together. Not because you are that person, but because it feels easier than disappointing their memory of you. But here's what you need to know. You don't owe anyone the performance of who they remember. You don't have to stay small to keep others comfortable. You don't have to carry the version of yourself they chose to keep frozen in time. Their perception is not your prison. Their memory is not your identity. They may never see the new you clearly, but that doesn't mean you're invisible. You are allowed to change, radically, quietly, permanently. You are allowed to outgrow people who only knew how to love the version of you that didn't love yourself yet. You are allowed to hold grief for the people who only loved your most wounded state. And yes, some of them will fall away, not because you're cruel, but because you're no longer performing. You're no longer handing out pieces of yourself just to earn a place at their table. You're building your own table now, one where the version of you who speaks up isn't too much, one where your needs aren't inconvenient, one where you don't have to play small to feel safe. And here's the truth no one tells you. The first person you need to convince of your growth is not them. It's you. You might still hear their voice in your decisions. You might still feel their judgment when you do something new. You might still carry the fear that you're slipping back into someone you used to be. But you're not. You're noticing now. You're choosing now. You're conscious in a way you never were before. That's growth. That's change. That's yours. So when the past tries to pull you back, not as a memory, but as an identity, you get to whisper, I'm not that person anymore. And even if I was, I still deserved more than what I got. Because the version of you they remember was surviving, but the version of you today is reclaiming. And that version, the one standing at the edge of your own becoming, deserves space to be seen for who you are now, not who you had to be to make it through. And as you begin to believe that more deeply, as you stop editing yourself to fit old roles and outdated scripts, another truth begins to rise beneath the surface. Maybe even the roles I played weren't me. Maybe I was shaped by the expectations of others, by what they needed me to be, by what the moment demanded. But now, I want to know who I am when I'm no longer performing for survival. And that quiet, curious question about the masks you wore and the roles you never chose is where we go next. You are not the role you had to play. There was a time when becoming someone else felt like the only way to survive. Maybe you became the peacemaker, the one who kept everything calm, even when you were falling apart inside. Maybe you became the overachiever, the one who always impressed, always performed, always proved you were worth keeping. Or maybe you became invisible, the quiet one, the one who didn't ask for much, the one who slipped under the surface so no one would have a reason to hurt you. Whatever your role was, you didn't choose it because it felt good. You chose it because it kept you safe. But here's what survival doesn't teach you: that one day you'd grow strong enough to not need the role anymore. So you keep playing it, even long after the danger is gone, even when the world is no longer asking you to shrink, even when the people around you now would love the real you, if only they got to meet them. Because the role became more than a habit. It became your identity. You forgot that you were someone before the performance, before you learned to scan every room for what version of you was most acceptable, before you mastered the art of becoming whatever the moment needed, before your self-worth became tied to how useful, likable, productive, or unproblematic you could be. No one told you that performing for love is not the same as receiving it. And now, you're tired, not from being too much, but from holding too much of yourself back. Here's the truth you were never told. You were never meant to play a role. You were meant to be messy, loud, contradictory, whole. The real you was not too much. They just didn't have room for your fullness. So you trimmed your edges, smoothed your texture, practiced your lines until they applauded you for the version of you that cost you the most to maintain. But that applause, it never reached the part of you that still felt unseen. Because no amount of approval can heal the pain of being loved for a mask. And no role, no matter how perfectly played, can bring peace to the parts of you still waiting backstage. So now, you get to leave the stage. You get to remove the costume. You get to exhale for real. And yes, it might feel terrifying, because the role gave you structure, gave you purpose, gave you rules to follow when everything else felt uncertain. But it also gave you shame. It told you who you couldn't be. It buried your joy under performance. And now you're allowed to want something else. You're allowed to be quiet when people expect you to entertain. You're allowed to ask for rest, even if you were always the one who carried everything. You're allowed to say no without offering a reason. You're allowed to change the story, because you were never born to be a role. You were born to be a person, a presence, a pulse, and you're still here, underneath the expectations, beneath the rehearsed lines, inside the silence you were once too afraid to fill. You are not the performance. You are the one who survived having to perform. And now, you get to come home. And as you step off that old stage and begin to feel your own gravity again, you might notice something strange. The version of you that kept everyone happy was praised, but not truly known. And now, as you finally begin to know yourself beyond the role, another truth rises. I had to become something to survive. But now, what if I didn't have to become anything at all? And that quiet return to your original self is where we go next. You are not what you had to become to survive. There are parts of you that were born out of necessity, not desire, not choice, but pure survival, the part that stays busy, so the sadness doesn't catch up, the part that makes jokes, so no one sees how scared you really are. The part that handles everything, so no one has the chance to let you down again. You didn't become this way on accident. You became this way because you had to. No one else stepped in, so you stepped up. No one else stayed, so you held it together alone. No one else offered safety, so you learned to become your own shelter. And it worked. You made it. You survived. But here's what survival doesn't teach you: how to stop surviving when the danger is gone. So now you sit in a life where the emergency is over, but your body still acts like it isn't. You wake up ready to defend. You walk into rooms scanning for disappointment. You brace for loss, even when nothing is threatening to leave. You've spent so long being strong that softness feels like a threat. So long being independent that asking for help feels like failure. So long being fine that you forget what it's like to be real. But this identity, this strong, capable, untouchable version of you, is not the full story. It's armor. And now it's heavy. You are not what you had to become. You are not the mask you wore to keep people close. You are not the strength that kept you silent. You are not the perfectionism that made you feel lovable. You are what exists underneath all of it. And that self, that true self, is still here, waiting, watching, wondering if it's finally safe to be seen. But how do you return to someone you've never really met? You start small. You let yourself rest without earning it. You speak the truth even if your voice shakes. You make space for feelings you once buried because they were too big for the environment you came from. You begin to notice the difference between who you are and who you had to be. And you choose, again and again, to come home to the parts you locked away just to get through. This isn't easy. Sometimes your survival self will fight back. It will say, "Don't let your guard down. Don't need anyone. Don't be weak." But that voice isn't your truth. It's your past. And the past doesn't get to define you anymore. Because now, you're not surviving. You're healing. And healing means becoming whole, not just functional. It means holding your strength and your softness in the same breath. It means saying, "Yes, I became that version to survive. But now, I get to become myself." And just as this chapter ends, this long unraveling of thoughts, roles, masks, and borrowed identities, you begin to feel something new, a quiet shift, a softness returning, not because you've reached the end, but because you've stopped running from where you are. And that, more than anything, is the beginning of a gentler kind of power, a slower kind of healing. And that is where we go next. How to feel safe. Feeling again. There was a time when feeling was dangerous, not in theory, but in your body, in your nervous system, in the way you flinched when emotions rose, even when no one was watching. Because once upon a time, your feelings made things worse. Crying led to silence. Anger led to punishment. Fear led to mockery. Joy led to being shamed for being too much. So you adapted, quickly, quietly, brilliantly. You built walls. You put your feelings away. And you wore calm like armor, not because you didn't feel, but because feeling no longer felt safe. But here's what no one ever taught you. Numbing isn't healing, and pushing it down only stores it deeper in the body. It leaks. It erupts. It confuses you in quiet moments when sadness visits uninvited and you don't know where it came from because you never really stopped feeling. You just stopped knowing how to let it move. Now you're older, freer, more aware, but the fear is still there. Every time a big feeling rises, grief, anger, longing, love, your body tenses, your heart races, your breath shortens, not because something's wrong, but because your nervous system remembers what it was like to feel and get hurt. So how do you come back? How do you learn to feel again without being swallowed? You start with permission, not to fix it, not to explain it, not to perform it, just to feel it. You say to yourself, it's okay to feel this. I can have this emotion without solving it. This is a wave, not a flood. You begin to anchor your body through breath, through touch, through presence. You stay. Even if your impulse is to run, you listen. Even if you don't yet understand, you soften. Even if the instinct is to tighten. Because safety in feeling doesn't come from certainty. It comes from capacity, from learning slowly that no emotion can destroy you if you stay with it like a witness, not a judge. It comes from realizing you are not the child anymore. You are not powerless. You are not voiceless. You are not stuck. You are the one who can hold what rises instead of fearing it will consume you. And yes, it takes time. Sometimes the softest feelings are the hardest to sit with. Joy that makes you cry. Love that feels undeserved. Grief that shows up years late. Anger you swallowed to keep the peace. Loneliness that used to feel like death now just feels like space. This is what healing sounds like. Not silence, but the sound of emotion, no longer needing to scream just to be heard. So when the feeling rises next time, whatever it is, don't rush to label it. Don't try to outrun it. Just breathe. Name it. Stay with it. You are not broken for feeling deeply. You were just never taught that feeling was a form of strength. But now, you are learning. And as you return to your emotional self, as the walls soften and the pulse comes back, you begin to wonder something gentle and terrifying. If feeling is allowed again, how will I know when I'm finally safe now? How will I tell the difference between past and present? And that question, how to discern danger from memory, is where we go next. How to tell the difference between past and present. Sometimes, the body doesn't know what time it is. You're in a room that's quiet, with people who are kind, doing something safe. But suddenly, your chest tightens, your thoughts race, your stomach sinks. You feel like you need to leave. Nothing's actually wrong, but something feels wrong. And that feeling becomes a story. They're pulling away. I'm not wanted here. Something bad is about to happen. Even when there's no danger, your body prepares for it. Why? Because you're not reacting to now. You're reacting to then. This is what trauma does. It untethers you from the present and anchors you in memory, not in images but in sensation, in tone, in silence, in the way a moment feels familiar even when nothing bad is actually happening. Your mind says, this is different, but your body says, this is the same, and the body usually wins. So how do you tell the difference? How do you know when the danger is real versus remembered? It begins with noticing. Noticing the speed of your reaction, the intensity, the automatic nature of your thoughts. Real danger builds gradually, but trauma responses arrive instantly. They don't ask for your opinion. They don't wait for proof. They just show up, uninvited, unquestioned, until now. Because now you can pause. Now you can say, my body is remembering something. This reaction is valid, but it might not be current. I'm not in that room anymore. I'm not that child anymore. I have options now. This is how you begin to interrupt the loop, not by forcing yourself to calm down, not by gaslighting your fear, but by gently reminding yourself what's actually happening right now. Where are you? What do you see? Who's with you? Are you safe in this moment, even if the past feels near? These questions anchor you, not in fantasy, but in truth. The goal isn't to erase the past. It's to stop living inside it. It's to give your nervous system new data, not through logic alone, but through experience. Each time you stay in a safe moment without fleeing it, you're teaching your body that not all intensity equals threat. Each time you breathe through discomfort without shutting down, you're showing your inner world that survival mode is no longer necessary. This takes time, but it works, and it begins with awareness. So next time something in you screams danger when there's no real threat, pause, check, breathe. You're not crazy, you're conditioned, you're remembering, and now you're learning to return to this room, to this moment, to this version of you who is no longer helpless. And the more you return, the more you begin to notice something else. Sometimes you do feel angry, not because you're being irrational, not because you're too emotional, but because for the first time, you're beginning to recognize what never felt fair. And that reconnection with your own inner fire is where we go next. How to be angry without losing yourself. For a long time, you thought anger was dangerous, not because someone said so, but because of what happened when it showed up. Maybe anger made someone explode, or disappear, or punish you for feeling what you felt. Maybe your own anger, when it finally rose, was so loud and so big that it scared even you. So you buried it. You smiled when you were hurt. You laughed when you were dismissed. You went silent when you should have been screaming. You didn't forget how to be angry. You just learned it wasn't safe to let it surface. But the truth is, anger is not violence. Anger is not harm. Anger is not a failure of healing. Anger is information. It's the part of you that says, this is not okay. I deserved better. That crossed a line. It's your inner boundary knocking on the door, asking to be heard, not to destroy, but to defend. So how do you let anger rise without losing yourself in it? You start by separating the feeling from the reaction. Anger on its own is not chaos. It's heat. It's tension. It's movement. It becomes destructive only when it's been held too long, silenced too often, invalidated until it explodes. So now you make space for it to speak before it screams. You say, something in me is angry, and that's okay. You ask, what is this anger protecting? Where did I first learn that anger only ends in pain? You don't suppress it. You don't indulge it. You listen. And in that pause, you begin to realize you can feel anger without becoming it. You are allowed to set boundaries without apologizing for your tone. You are allowed to say no without softening it into a maybe. You are allowed to speak hard truths without cushioning them to be more digestible. Your anger is not cruelty. It is clarity. It is the energy of your unmet needs finally asking for room to exist. And yes, sometimes it'll come out messy. That's okay. You're unlearning generations of silence. You're reclaiming a voice that was punished for too long. You don't need to get it perfect. You just need to get it honest. You just need to stay present. You just need to remind yourself, I can feel this fully without abandoning who I am. Because healthy anger doesn't disconnect you from yourself. It reconnects you to your worth. And once the heat moves, once the storm softens, you're still here. You didn't lose yourself. You met yourself. And what you'll notice next, after the clarity of anger, is a different kind of tension. The resistance to slowing down. The difficulty of doing nothing. The fear that rest means weakness. And learning to rest after years of hypervigilance is where we go next. How to rest. When you've been in survival mode for years, your body may stop, but your mind doesn't. You lie down, but you're not resting. You're calculating, you're scanning, you're bracing for the next thing, the next demand, the next disappointment. Even in stillness, you're preparing. Because for so long, rest didn't mean safety. It meant exposure. If you slowed down, things could fall apart. If you let go, someone could get hurt. If you stopped moving, you might feel something you weren't ready to feel. So rest became dangerous, even when your body begged for it. That's what survival mode does. It turns tension into normal. It turns exhaustion into identity. It convinces you that holding it all together is the only way to keep everything from collapsing. And even when the crisis is over, your body doesn't believe it yet. You still check for danger in every silence. You still feel guilt every time you exhale. You still think you need to earn what should have always been your right: peace. So, how do you rest when your system has forgotten how? You begin by recognizing this. Rest is not a reward. It's a birthright. You don't have to deserve it. You don't have to achieve it. You don't have to finish the list or fix yourself first. You just have to begin. Maybe it's 5 minutes of doing nothing without numbing out. Maybe it's letting your body sink into the chair without gripping your breath. Maybe it's noticing the sky without wondering what you should be doing instead. And maybe, at first, it will feel unbearable. Like you're wasting time. Like something bad is going to happen. Like the world will stop spinning if you do. That's okay. You're not failing. You're detoxing from urgency. Because your nervous system was trained to move fast, to fix, to produce, to never relax. But now, you're teaching it something new. We are safe here. We can soften. We can let the moment hold us without needing to outrun it. Rest isn't just physical. It's emotional. It's spiritual. It's a quiet rebellion against everything that told you your worth was tied to how hard you work. And here's the thing. No one tells you. When you finally allow rest, you begin to feel all the things you've been running from. The grief that had no time. The joy that felt too dangerous. The rage that was buried under productivity. Rest reveals. It brings you back to yourself. It says, here's what's been waiting beneath the doing. And yes, that can feel overwhelming. But it's also holy. Because only in stillness can we hear what truly matters. Only in softness can we feel what's truly been carried. So if rest feels hard, you're not lazy, you're not broken, you're healing. You're learning to exist outside the emergency. You're rebuilding trust with the part of you that forgot it's okay to stop. You're creating space for your body to breathe without performing for survival. And in that space, you may begin to wonder, if I don't have to work for love, can I receive it? And learning how to receive without earning is where we go next. How to receive without earning. It's always been easier to give. You know how to show up, how to anticipate needs, how to make people feel seen, heard, held. You pride yourself on being strong, being capable, being the one others lean on. But when someone turns to you with love, with support, with generosity, something in you tenses. You smile, you thank them, but deep down, you're uncomfortable. Because giving feels safe, it's controlled, it puts you in the position of power. Receiving feels exposed, vulnerable, like you're taking more than you deserve. You tell yourself, they're just being polite. I shouldn't need help. I don't want to be a burden. You don't even realize that buried beneath your discomfort is a quiet belief. I have to earn everything I get. Where did you learn that? Maybe it was a childhood where love was conditional, where praise only came after perfection, where kindness was currency, not something freely given. Maybe you learned that your needs were too much, or that receiving made you selfish. So you adapted. You became the giver, the helper, the one who never asked for anything unless it was absolutely necessary, and slowly you forgot how to be open. But here's the truth. Receiving is not taking. Receiving is not selfish. Receiving is not weakness. Receiving is a practice, a relationship, an act of trust. It says, I believe I am worthy not because of what I do, but because of who I am. And that belief might feel radical at first, but it's the foundation of every healthy relationship. So how do you begin? You start small. You notice the reflex to deflect praise, to downplay compliments, to reject help before it's fully offered, and instead of pushing it away, you pause. You breathe. You say, thank you. Yes, that would help. I'm letting that in. It might feel foreign, even wrong, but that's only because it's unfamiliar, not because it's untrue. You are allowed to be loved without being useful. You are allowed to be cared for on your worst day, not just your best. You are allowed to be carried sometimes, to be comforted, to be given to, not because you've earned it, but because being human means needing others. And letting yourself receive doesn't make you weak. It makes you real. So the next time someone offers care in any form, notice what rises in you, the resistance, the guilt, the fear, and then, gently, choose to receive anyway. Because every time you let love in without auditioning for it, you rewrite a deeper story. A story that says, I am not a transaction. I am not a performance. I am someone who gets to be held too. And once you begin to let that love land, not just understand it, but feel it, you may start to notice something even softer. What if I don't have to keep performing to be safe? What if I can let love in without turning it into a job? And learning how to be loved without performing for it is where we go next. How to let love in without performing. At some point, you learn that love had a shape, a posture, a tone, a list of unspoken requirements. Be agreeable. Be helpful. Don't need too much. Don't take up space. So you became the version of yourself that fit what others wanted. You smiled through discomfort. You gave even when you were empty. You said yes when everything in you wanted to say no. Not because you were fake, but because you were afraid. Afraid that if you stopped performing, love would disappear. That fear didn't come from nowhere. It came from patterns, from moments where your authenticity was met with rejection, where being too honest made people pull away, where being too sad made you feel like a burden. So you adjusted. You shaped yourself into something more palatable. You became lovable by being less you. But here's the quiet tragedy of performing for love. Even when people love you, you don't fully feel it. Because somewhere in the back of your mind, a voice whispers, they don't love me. They love the version I gave them. And so the love never really lands. It floats above you, outside of you, because it's not touching the parts of you that feel most true. So how do you let love in without the performance? You begin with a risk. The risk of being seen in your natural shape, uncurated, unsmoothed, unapologetic. You start by telling the truth, even when it feels awkward, even when you think it might be too much, even when your voice shakes. You practice saying, I don't feel okay today. I need a little space right now. Actually, I disagree. And when love stays, when someone doesn't flinch or withdraw or punish you for showing up fully, you begin to rewrite the script. Because real love doesn't ask you to audition for worthiness. It doesn't shrink when you're struggling. It doesn't vanish when you're inconvenient. It meets you where you are, not where you pretend to be. And the more you trust that, the less you'll need the mask. The less you'll feel the urge to be charming or impressive or agreeable all the time. You'll learn that you can just be present and still be loved. That kind of love is slow. It's earned through honesty, not perfection. And sometimes the hardest part isn't receiving it. It's believing you don't have to work for it anymore. That even when you're tired, quiet, unfiltered, you are still enough. So when love comes next time, pause before you adjust. Notice the impulse to become better, brighter, less complicated. And then breathe. Stay in your shape. Let love meet you this time, not the character you used to play. Let it touch the parts you used to hide, the ones that always wondered, if I stop performing, will they stay? And when someone does stay, not because you entertained them, but because you were real, that's not just love, that's liberation. And once you feel that love land in your bare hands, unearned, unscripted, you may find yourself asking, if I don't have to guard my heart so tightly, how do I stay soft without getting hurt again? And that gentle balancing act between openness and protection is where we go next. How to stay soft without getting hurt. Again, you weren't always guarded. There was a time you trusted easily. You felt fully. You loved without checking if it was too much. You spoke what was real without overthinking how it would land. But life had other plans. It taught you that being soft came with consequences. So you learned to protect yourself, not with walls, but with silence, with distance, with a careful, practiced version of you that didn't risk too much. Not because you stopped caring, but because you started surviving. Now, even when love arrives, you hesitate. You hesitate to hope. You hesitate to open. You hesitate to stay present with how deeply you still want connection. Because in the quiet places of your heart, there's a belief that whispers, if I stay soft, I'll break again. And you're tired of breaking. But here's what healing slowly reveals. Staying soft doesn't mean staying unguarded. It means learning the difference between boundaries and barriers, between self-protection and self-abandonment. Softness isn't about being exposed to harm. It's about being connected to yourself even while moving through a world that doesn't always know how to hold you. It's a strength that says, I can feel deeply without losing my center. So how do you stay soft without shattering? You begin by choosing softness for you, not for them. Softness that says, I will be gentle with my own fear. I will meet my sadness without judgment. I will not turn cold just because others couldn't hold me. You stop using hardness as a mask for safety. You stop equating numbness with control. You begin to trust that your presence, not your defenses, is what keeps you whole. It's okay to move slowly. It's okay to take your time with trust. It's okay to say, I'm open, but I'm watching how you hold me. Staying soft doesn't mean ignoring red flags. It means you keep your heart open without handing it to someone who hasn't earned it. It means knowing your worth so deeply that you can offer love without needing it to prove anything about you. Because softness isn't weakness. It's the courage to feel when it would be easier to shut down. It's the strength to keep caring in a world that rewards detachment. It's the quiet power of saying, I will not let this world turn me into someone I am not. And when you live from that place, not armored but anchored, you begin to notice something new. The pain of the past no longer decides your posture. You can feel everything and still hold yourself together. You can let someone in and still know how to stay with you. You can love and lose and still choose to remain whole. And maybe then, you'll begin to wonder, if I let myself be this soft, how will I know when it's safe to trust again? Not just people, but life itself. And that quiet return to trust and intuition is where we go next. How to know when it's safe to trust. Trust used to be instinct, something you felt before you questioned it, before the betrayals, before the subtle neglect, before the times you told someone who you really were, and they didn't stay. You used to move toward people with an open heart, but now Now your heart scans every situation like a locked door with a tiny peephole. You want to believe, you want to soften, but something in you whispers, be careful. Don't fall for it again. That voice is not your enemy. It's your protector. It watched you trust when you weren't ready. It watched you give too much too fast. It watched you ignore the tension in your gut because you didn't want to seem paranoid, or needy, or too much. So now, it speaks louder. It says, slow down, look closer, hold your cards. And for a while that was necessary. But now, you want something deeper than protection. You want connection. You want ease. You want to stop second-guessing everyone who reaches for you. So the question becomes, how do I know when it's safe to trust? Again. You don't start by trusting them. You start by trusting you, your nervous system, your body, your intuition, the parts of you that were once overridden in the name of love, because most of the time you did feel it. The discomfort, the hesitation, the offness you couldn't explain. But you stayed, because you thought that's what love required. Now you listen differently, not with your head alone, but with your whole being. How does your body respond when you're with them? Do you feel like you can exhale? Or are you managing the moment? Do you leave interactions feeling more grounded or more self-doubtful? Do you feel safe to be messy, honest, real, or just safe from judgment as long as you perform? The answers live there, not in perfection, but in your experience. Trust doesn't mean certainty. It means noticing. Noticing how someone handles your no, how they respond when you have a need, how they behave when your light dims or your mood shifts. Do they meet you there? Do they hold your complexity? Or do they only stay as long as you make things easy? Real trust isn't built in declarations. It's built in moments. Repeated, consistent, ordinary moments where someone shows you, you can rest here. You can be human here. You don't have to audition for safety. But even then, even when someone is safe, it still takes time. Time for your body to unlearn the alarms. Time for your heart to feel the ground again. Time for your inner protector to realize we're not in the same place anymore. And that's okay. You're not late. You're not broken. You're just rebuilding. So how do you know it's safe? You begin by watching how people hold your truth, how you hold your own, and how your body responds when you stop pretending everything is fine. And maybe in one of those moments, something new will happen. You won't flinch. You won't apologize. You won't shrink. You'll stay. Not because you're forcing trust, but because for the first time in a long time you feel it. And from there, a new question arises. Now that I'm learning to trust others, how do I stop abandoning myself first? And that quiet inner return to self-loyalty is where we go next. How to stop abandoning yourself. First, it doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes self-abandonment sounds like, it's fine. I don't want to make a big deal. Maybe I'm overreacting. It looks like silence when you actually had something to say. Like agreeing when every cell in your body said no. Like staying when your heart already started walking away. It's subtle. It's quiet. It's disguised as kindness, patience, humility. But deep down, you feel it. That sting of knowing you just walked away from yourself so someone else wouldn't. You learned this wasn't just acceptable. It was noble. You were praised for it. For being easygoing. For being low maintenance. For being the one who always understood. But what they called understanding was often just you swallowing your needs before anyone had to see them. You made yourself small so no one else had to adjust. And over time, that became your default. Disappear just enough to be loved. But here's what that kind of love costs. You never feel fully held. Because no one's holding you. only the version you shrink into. You never feel fully known, because you're always editing the truth to keep the peace. And eventually, you start to feel lonely, even in connection, because the deepest part of you is always left behind. So how do you stop abandoning yourself? You start with a quiet promise. I will not leave me, even if others do, even if it feels uncomfortable, even if it changes everything. You begin to listen for the small moments where you normally fold, when you pretend you're okay, when you say yes out of guilt, when you feel something rise, anger, grief, desire, and try to push it away to stay likable. And instead of performing, you pause, you check in, you ask yourself, what's true for me right now? And then you honor it, not loudly, not perfectly, but honestly. This is how self-loyalty is rebuilt, not through grand declarations, but through thousands of tiny choices to stay with yourself, to hold your own hand when no one else understands, to say, I hear you, even when the world tells you to quiet down, to choose truth over approval, self-respect over comfort, integrity over pleasing, not because it's easy, but because it's yours. And yes, some people will fall away. Not everyone knows how to meet the version of you that doesn't bend so easily. But the ones who stay, they'll be staying with the real you. And that changes everything. Because when you stop abandoning yourself, you stop asking others to prove your worth. You stop needing their validation to feel whole. You stop outsourcing your safety to people who were never meant to carry it. So the next time you feel the pull to disconnect from yourself, to say yes when it's a no, to laugh when you want to cry, to stay silent when your soul wants to speak, pause, breathe, choose you, and say, even if they don't understand, I won't leave me this time. And as that commitment deepens, as your inner world starts to trust that you're not going anywhere, a new kind of possibility emerges. If I don't have to run anymore, if I don't have to abandon, perform, or protect, what would it feel like to begin again? And that quiet rebirth, that soft, courageous return to possibility, is where we go next. How to begin. Again. You thought you had to fix everything before starting over. You thought healing meant returning to some perfect version of yourself you barely remember. You thought beginning again meant erasing everything that went wrong, everything you regret, everything that still hurts when it shows up in quiet moments. But it doesn't. To begin again doesn't mean you start fresh. It means you start honestly, right here, exactly as you are. Not healed, not certain, not whole in the way you imagined, but willing, present, ready in a way you couldn't have been before. Because now, you carry wisdom you earned. You see things you used to ignore. You speak softer with yourself. You know how to hold pain without letting it write your story. You know how to stay, even when it would be easier to disappear. You know what it means to survive. But now, you want to live. Beginning again doesn't mean you forget who you were. It means you stop being defined by it. You carry your past like a lantern, not a chain. You bring it with you only for light, not for weight. You let it inform you, not imprison you. Because the story of your life was never supposed to be written in just one chapter. And maybe this new chapter isn't dramatic, isn't marked by huge transformation or sudden clarity. Maybe it's quiet, maybe it's slow, maybe it's just you, waking up one morning and deciding, today, I will treat myself like someone I am learning to trust again. That is enough. That is profound. That is beginning again. It might look like setting a boundary that you couldn't have set a year ago, or resting without guilt, or asking for help before you hit your breaking point. It might look like softening after years of being hardened, or letting someone in just a little more than you did yesterday. It might look like joy that sneaks in when you least expect it. Whatever it looks like, don't dismiss it. Your new beginning doesn't have to be loud to be life-changing. And no, you don't have to know where it leads. You don't need a 5-year plan. You don't need to heal everything overnight. You just need one quiet, radical thing. Permission. Permission to be new, to be different, to want more, to move forward even if you're still a little bit scared, especially if you're still a little bit scared. So take a breath and say to yourself, this isn't the end. It never was. It's the soft beginning of something more honest, more whole, more mine. You are not starting over. You are beginning from wisdom. And this time you're bringing all of you with you, even the soft parts, especially the soft parts, because that was always your power. But maybe it's the beginning of something even more important, your return to yourself.